It began with a man who seemed carved out of contradiction. George Patton walked into history like a thunderstorm, brilliant, violent, disciplined, unpredictable, fearless, terrified of failure, and absolutely convinced he had been born for war. Before he ever commanded a tank, before a single photograph captured his cold stare beneath a polished helmet, he felt the pull of something ancient inside him. Not ambition, not duty. Something older. Something primal, as if every battlefield from every century whispered his name before he ever stepped onto one. Patton lived in a world of steel and gasoline, but he dreamed in iron and dust. He believed he had fought long before the 20th century in armour, on horseback, with a sword drawn beneath foreign suns. He carried ghosts with him, not because he feared them, but because he believed they walked beside him. When he stared at a map, he didn't see lines, he saw fate. When he gave orders, he didn't speak like a man, he spoke like a force. Yet the world around him was not ancient, it was burning with modern fire. Europe had fractured, nations were swallowed. Armies crumbled, civilians fled across roads, turned into graveyards. The war needed leaders who could see beyond doubt, beyond hesitation, beyond fear. Leaders who could turn chaos into direction. And into that vacuum stepped a man who seemed born for disaster and destiny in equal measure. Patton was a storm the Allies were both grateful for and afraid of. His soldiers respected him because he demanded everything but gave everything back. He walked among them with a swagger that felt theatrical but was fueled by a genuine belief that courage could be taught, shaped, forged. He pushed them harder than they wanted to be pushed, not out of cruelty, but because he believed the battlefield would be far less forgiving than he ever could be. He admired bravery. He despised excuses. He believed victory required momentum, and momentum required audacity. Through North Africa, through Sicily, through France, through the frozen hell of winter, Patton moved like a blade, slicing through the fog of war. He studied terrain like it was scripture, memorized distances the way poets memorize lines, and demanded speed from armies stunned by how quickly he expected them to change the course of events. Behind the scenes, he was restless. He paced rooms like a caged animal. He wrote speeches that sounded like prophecy. He confessed fears to his diary that he would never show his men. He doubted himself more than he ever doubted his enemies. Patton was not simple. He was not gentle. He was not always right. But he was a force, one whose presence reshaped the war simply by existing inside it. And the closer the Allies came to Germany, the more crucial his instincts became. He saw patterns others missed. He sensed weaknesses others dismissed. He pushed, he pressured, he argued, he defied command structures that moved too slowly for his taste. He wanted the war ended. Not eventually, but now, decisively, aggressively, without hesitation. Tonight, we step back into the life of a man who refused to be ordinary. A man whose myth threatened to overshadow the truth, and whose truth was stranger, sharper, and more human than the legend that followed him. A man who could inspire, infuriate, terrify, and mesmerize sometimes in the same breath. A man who believed destiny had chosen him, and who lived each day trying to prove it right. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something simple, in your own words. Where are you listening from tonight? And what kind of energy is in the room around you? Calm, quiet, heavy, alive. I want to feel the moment with you. And something a little more personal, something emotional, as you hear this story begin. Is there someone from your own life, past or present, who comes to mind when you think of determination or stubbornness or strength? You don't need to explain why. Just say the name if you want to. And one last invitation, unique to this documentary, Patton believed every person carries a fire inside them, even if they can't see it. If there is a moment in your life when you felt your own fire flicker, even briefly tell me what sparked it. Not the struggle, but the spark. And if these long, quiet journeys into the past help you settle, unwind, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. San Marino Ranch, California, November 11, 1885. A 6-year-old boy sits cross-legged on a Persian rug in his grandfather's library, firelight dancing across leather-bound volumes that line every wall from floor to ceiling. His father reads aloud from Homer's Iliad, voice rising and falling with the rhythm of ancient Greek warfare, while outside the California twilight fades into darkness. The boy's eyes are closed, not from sleepiness but from concentration so intense his small hands clench into fists. He sees the battle, he feels the bronze spear in his hand. He knows, with the certainty that only children possess, that he has been here before. This is not a story being read to him. This is a memory being awakened. George Smith Patton Jr. is remembering who he is supposed to become. The Patton family didn't just teach military history, they worshipped it like a religion. And young George was born into a congregation of warrior saints who treated battlefield glory as the only form of immortality worth pursuing. His grandfather, George Smith Patton Sr., had commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry for the Confederacy until a Union sharpshooter's bullet killed him at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. His great-uncle, Waller Tazewell Patton, fell at Gettysburg, leading Pickett's charge, shot down within yards of the Union line during that doomed assault on Cemetery Ridge. The family spoke of these men not as casualties, but as heroes who had achieved the highest possible human achievement: death, in battle while leading men forward. Every evening meal became a seminar on tactical decisions made at Chancellorsville or cavalry charges at Brandy Station. Every bedtime story came from Plutarch's Lives or Caesar's commentaries. The message was unmistakable and relentless. Patton men were born to command armies, and anything less than generalship was failure. But young George had a problem that threatened to derail this destiny before it could begin. He couldn't read. The letters on the page swam and reversed themselves, forming incomprehensible patterns that other children seemed to decode effortlessly. What we would now recognise as severe dyslexia remained undiagnosed in the 1880s, leaving George to conclude that he was simply stupid, a humiliation that burned like acid in a boy who was supposed to be a military genius. He compensated through pure memorization, having his parents read texts aloud until he could recite entire chapters of military history, word for word, without understanding a single written symbol. He didn't learn to read fluently until age 11, 5 years behind his peers, 5 years of hidden shame that he covered with aggressive confidence. That compensatory aggression would define his entire career. The boy who felt stupid learned to act as if he knew everything. The child who struggled with letters learned to dominate through sheer force of personality. By the time George Patton could finally read, he had already constructed the psychological armour he would wear for the rest of his life. Never admit weakness, never show doubt, never let anyone see the frightened child beneath the warrior's mask. September 11, 1909. Fort Sheridan, Illinois. Second Lieutenant George Patton stands before a full-length mirror in the quarters he shares with his new bride, Beatrice Ayer, adjusting his dress uniform with obsessive precision. The brass buttons must catch the light at exactly the right angle. The sword must hang at precisely the correct height. The expression on his face, most importantly, must project absolute dominance. He practices what he calls his war face, a look of cold fury designed to make enlisted men obey without question and enemy soldiers fear without fighting. Beatrice watches from the doorway, 24 years old, and already understanding that she has married not a man, but a mission. "Do you really think you can scare people just by looking at them?" she asks, amused and slightly concerned. Patton turns from the mirror, the war face still in place. Alexander the Great conquered the known world before he was 33. I'm 24. I'm already behind schedule. The marriage to Beatrice Ayer was strategic as much as romantic, though Patton genuinely loved her with the same intensity he brought to everything else. She was the daughter of Frederick Ayer, a textile industrialist worth millions, giving George financial independence that few army officers enjoyed in an era when military service meant poverty. That independence would prove crucial, allowing Patton to take career risks that other officers couldn't afford, to speak his mind when prudence demanded silence, to pursue expensive training and equipment that the army wouldn't provide. But the money came with social expectations that clashed with Patton's warrior identity. Beatrice's Boston family expected a gentleman officer who attended the right parties and advanced through political connections. George wanted to be Achilles. The tension between these two identities, the aristocratic socialite and the warrior mystic, would pull Patton in opposing directions throughout his life. He needed the wealth to pursue military greatness, but he resented the social obligations that wealth imposed. He wanted to be seen as a cultured gentleman, but he believed that true warriors transcended civilization. He was trapped between two centuries, a 19th century warrior, forced to operate in the 20th century's bureaucratic military. Stockholm, Sweden, July 7, 1912. The fifth modern Olympic Games. Patton competes in the military pentathlon: pistol shooting, sword fencing, swimming, horseback riding, and cross-country running. He believes he is one of the finest athletes in the world, a modern pentathlete in the ancient Greek tradition, and he has trained obsessively for this moment. But in the pistol shooting event, disaster strikes. Patton scores only 177 points out of 200, finishing 21st out of 42 competitors. He immediately protests to the judges, insisting that several of his shots were so accurate they passed through holes already made in the target, leaving no visible mark. The judges reject his appeal. No evidence supports his claim. Patton finishes 5th overall, missing a medal by 194 points. For the rest of his life, he will insist he was cheated, that he actually won, that only corrupt judging prevented his Olympic gold medal. It becomes a formative wound, proof that excellence isn't enough if the system is rigged against you. The persecution complex that will eventually destroy his career begins here, in Stockholm, with a 26-year-old officer who cannot accept that he simply missed the target. But Patton's Olympic obsession reveals something deeper than mere athletic ambition. He genuinely believed that modern warfare required ancient warrior skills, that industrial combat was making soldiers soft, that victory would ultimately come to the army that best embodied classical military virtues. In 1913, he travelled to Saumur, France, home of the French cavalry school, to study sword fighting with the finest fencing masters in Europe. He spent his own money, used his own leave time, drove himself to exhaustion, perfecting the art of mounted sabre combat in an era when cavalry charges were already becoming obsolete. Then he did something extraordinary. He designed a new cavalry sabre for the United States Army based on his studies of medieval swordsmanship and modern metallurgy. The model 1913 cavalry sabre, officially adopted by the War Department, featured a straight 35-inch blade designed purely for thrusting rather than slashing, optimized for penetrating modern uniforms and equipment. It became known as the Patton sabre, and it was completely useless. Within 5 years, cavalry charges would be extinct, killed by machine guns and barbed wire. But the sabre represented Patton's fundamental approach to military innovation. He studied the past obsessively, extracted principles he believed were timeless, then adapted them to contemporary weapons and tactics. Sometimes this produced genius. Sometimes it produced medieval swords for an age of mechanized warfare. Fort Bliss, Texas. March 15, 1916. Pancho Villa has just raided Columbus, New Mexico, killing 18 Americans in a cross-border raid that has shocked the nation. General John Pershing is assembling a punitive expedition to pursue Villa into Mexico, and Lieutenant Patton volunteers immediately, using family connections to secure a position on Pershing's staff. He becomes Pershing's aide-de-camp, essentially a personal assistant, a job that seems like career suicide for an ambitious officer. But Patton understands something his peers don't. Proximity to a successful commander matters more than prestigious assignments. He wants to learn from Pershing, to study how a general thinks and plans and leads, to position himself for rapid promotion when America inevitably enters the European War that has been raging since 1914. On May 14, 1916, Patton leads a motorized raid against a Villa lieutenant named Giulio Cardenas, attacking a ranch with 3 automobiles and 15 men. The firefight lasts 7 minutes. Patton personally shoots Cardenas twice with his ivory-handled Colt revolver at close range. He straps the bodies of Cardenas and 2 other dead Villa soldiers to the hood of his Dodge touring car like hunting trophies and drives back to headquarters. Pershing is simultaneously impressed and disturbed. The newspapers call Patton the bandit killer. He is 30 years old and has finally killed his first men in combat, and he loves it. The Mexico expedition teaches Patton another crucial lesson. Modern warfare belongs to machines, not horses. The 3 automobiles that carried his raiders across the desert moved faster and farther than any cavalry could have managed. When Villa's forces used cars instead of horses, they consistently outmaneuvered Pershing's cavalry columns. Patton begins to understand that the cavalry he loves is dying, that the future of warfare is mechanical, that the warrior spirit he worships must find new tools or become extinct. He starts reading everything he can find about armoured cars, experimental tracked vehicles, and European experiments with land battleships. His fellow officers mock him for abandoning cavalry tradition, but Patton has always been willing to abandon anything except winning. If victory requires machines instead of horses, he'll become a machine warrior. If modern combat means engines instead of sabres, he'll master engines. The warrior doesn't serve the weapon serves the warrior. This flexibility, this willingness to abandon beloved traditions in pursuit of tactical superiority, will make Patton one of the few American officers ready for the mechanized warfare that's about to sweep across Europe. Patton's study, late at night, sometime in 1916 or early 1917, the walls are covered with maps, ancient battlefields from Marathon to Waterloo, modern fronts from the Marne to Verdun. Patton sits at his desk, writing in his diary by lamplight, surrounded by books on military history, tactical theory, and warrior philosophy. The entry he writes this night will be quoted for decades after his death. I have studied war as few men have. I have read every account of every battle in history. I have walked the ground where great captains led their men to victory. I know I will be a great general. I have known this since childhood. The question is not whether I will achieve greatness. The question is only when, and whether America will let me do what I was born to do before it is too late. He puts down his pen and stares at the map of France on the wall. Where millions of men are dying in the trenches of the Western Front, somewhere in those blood-soaked fields is his destiny. Somewhere in that mechanized slaughter is the war that will prove he is who he has always believed himself to be. He just needs to get there. He just needs them to let him fight. The tragedy of George Patton's early life is that he spent 30 years preparing for a destiny that might never arrive. He trained for cavalry warfare just as cavalry became obsolete. He perfected swordsmanship in an age of machine guns. He studied Napoleonic tactics while Europe invented industrial slaughter. Everything he believed about warfare was becoming ancient history even as he learnt it. But hidden within that tragedy was the seed of his future genius. Patton understood that warfare's tools change, but its fundamental nature doesn't. Armies still need to move faster than their enemies. Soldiers still need to believe their commander is tougher than the opponent. Victory still comes to the side that maintains offensive momentum and breaks the enemy's will to fight. The principles Patton learned from ancient battles would prove transferable to modern mechanized combat in ways neither he nor his critics could predict. The 6-year-old boy listening to Homer in his grandfather's library was preparing for tank warfare in World War II without knowing it. The destiny he felt so certain about was real. He just had to survive long enough for the world to catch up to his vision. Berg, France, May 10, 1918. Captain George Patton stands in a muddy courtyard watching French soldiers unload the first tanks delivered to American forces, 30 Renault FT-17 light tanks that have just arrived by rail from Paris. The machines are ugly, tiny, smelling of gasoline and hot metal, barely 7 tons each with armor plate riveted together like a metal shed on tracks. The soldiers unloading them treat them like cargo, just another piece of equipment to be catalogued and stored. But Patton moves toward the nearest tank, as if approaching a sacred object, running his hand along the riveted steel hull the way another man might caress a lover's face. He circles it slowly, studying the simple design, a rotating turret mounting a single 37mm cannon, track assembly that could theoretically climb trenches and cross barbed wire, a tiny gasoline engine that could push the machine to 4 miles per hour maximum speed. It is primitive, crude, barely functional. It is the future. Patton knows this the way he knew as a child that he was destined to be a general. This machine will change warfare forever, and he will be the man who understands it first. The American Expeditionary Force had no tanks when it arrived in France, no tank doctrine, no tank training schools, no officers who understood how armoured vehicles might be used in combat. The British and French had been experimenting with tanks since 1916, using them as infantry support weapons to cross trenches and break through wire obstacles during major offensives. The British Mark series tanks were massive rhomboid-shaped machines weighing 28 tons, carrying crews of 8 men armed with naval guns. The French Renault FT-17 was radically different. Small, fast, agile, with a rotating turret that could engage targets in any direction. The British concept was the tank as moving fortress. The French concept was the tank as armoured cavalry. Patton studied both approaches and immediately sided with the French. He saw in the little Renault what cavalrymen had always sought: speed, mobility, shock action, the ability to exploit breakthroughs and disrupt enemy rear areas. When General Pershing asked for volunteers to command the new American Tank Corps, Patton abandoned his prestigious staff position and volunteered immediately. His peers thought he was insane, throwing away a promising career to command experimental weapons that would probably fail. But Patton had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The cavalry of the future had arrived. It just happened to have engines instead of legs. Langres, France. January 15, 1918. Patton assumes command of the 1st United States Tank School with orders to train American soldiers in tank warfare using French equipment and French instructors. He has 144 tanks, most of them not yet delivered. He has 2 officers and 26 enlisted men, none with any tank experience. He has 2 months to create an American tank force from nothing. Patton attacks the problem with manic energy, working 18-hour days, personally training every tank driver, gunner, and mechanic. He crawls inside the tank's engines to understand every component. He drives them cross-country until he knows exactly what slopes they can climb and what terrain will bog them down. He fires the guns until he understands their accuracy and rate of fire. He reads every French manual on tank employment and every British after-action report from tank battles. Then he starts writing his own doctrine. American tanks, Patton decides, will not be used like British or French tanks. They will operate in massed formations, not scattered among infantry units. They will exploit breakthroughs, not just support attacks. They will move fast, strike hard, and keep moving. He is inventing blitzkrieg tactics 20 years before the Germans will use them to conquer Europe, and nobody except Patton realizes it. September 26, 1918, 9:30 a.m. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The largest American military operation in history, 1.2 million American soldiers attacking along a 30-mile front toward the strategic rail junction at Sedan. Patton's 304th Tank Brigade, 144 Renault FT, 17 tanks organized into 2 battalions, is supposed to support the 35th Infantry Division's advance near the village of Chepi, but Patton isn't in his command post coordinating the attack. He's walking ahead of his tanks through German machine gun fire, exposed in the open, waving his walking stick like he's directing traffic, shouting orders that none of his tank crews can hear over the engine noise and artillery explosions. Bullets snap past his head, shells throw up geysers of dirt around him. German machine guns from Chepi pour fire into the advancing Americans, cutting down infantry and forcing Patton's tanks to slow their advance. One of Patton's junior officers, Lieutenant Paul Edwards, shouts at him to take cover. Patton ignores him, walking forward into the fire. He believes absolutely that he cannot be killed until he has fulfilled his destiny, that God or fate or whatever force controls the universe will protect him until he achieves the greatness he was promised. He is either supremely brave or completely insane, possibly both. At approximately 9:45 a.m., Patton's luck runs out. A German machine gun position near Chepi opens fire at close range, hitting Patton in the left thigh and buttocks with multiple bullets. He goes down hard, dragged to a shell crater by his orderly Private First Class Joseph Angelo, while machine gun bullets continue to tear through the air above them. Patton is bleeding heavily, probably going into shock, but still conscious and furious. He gives Angelo his final orders: find the tank, battalion commanders, and tell them to continue the attack without stopping, to keep moving forward no matter what happens. Then he passes out from blood loss. Angelo will later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for staying with Patton under fire and dragging him to an aid station. Patton will receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, and a promotion to colonel. But more importantly, he has learnt something that will shape his entire approach to combat leadership. Soldiers follow officers who share their dangers. Men will advance into hell if they believe their commander is willing to die with them. The walking stick and the exposed leadership become part of the Patton legend, the proof that Old Blood and Guts puts himself at risk, that he doesn't ask his men to do anything he won't do himself. It's partially true, but it also obscures the calculation behind the courage. Patton knows that his personal recklessness creates a psychological weapon more powerful than any gun. The Meuse-Argonne offensive lasts until November 11, but Patton spends most of it in a hospital bed, recovering from his wounds and dictating after-action reports to anyone who will listen. The reports are extraordinary documents, 47 days of combat, compressed into tactical analysis that predicts the future of armoured warfare with eerie accuracy. Patton writes that tanks should operate in massed formations of at least 200 vehicles to achieve breakthrough. He argues that tanks need radios to coordinate movement and organic artillery to suppress anti-tank weapons. He predicts that future wars will be decided by mechanized spearheads that penetrate enemy lines and disrupt rear areas, that the combination of tanks and aircraft will make static trench warfare obsolete, that nations which master mechanized warfare will dominate those that don't. He is describing Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of France in 1940, 20 years before they happen. The army files his reports and ignores them. The war ends, the tank corps is disbanded, and Patton finds himself facing a choice between career suicide and survival. Washington, D.C. March 15, 1920. The National Defense Act is working its way through Congress, and Patton follows the debate with growing horror. The act will eliminate the tank corps as an independent branch, subordinating all tanks to the infantry branch and prohibiting any development of tanks as an independent arm. The reasoning is bureaucratic but devastating. The war is over, defense budgets are being slashed, the army is returning to its pre-war size and structure, and there's no room for experimental weapons in a peacetime military. Patton understands exactly what this means. Everything he learned about tank warfare will be declared obsolete and forbidden. The tactics he developed will be suppressed. The vision of mechanized warfare he articulated will be rejected. He can continue advocating for an independent tank force and destroy his career, or he can shut up and return to the cavalry where promotion remains possible. He chooses survival. In June 1920, Patton transfers back to the cavalry, leaving behind the machines he called the cavalry of the future and returning to horses that everyone except the cavalry officers knows are militarily extinct. It is the most painful decision of his life to this point. It will have consequences for decades. Camp Meade, Maryland. 1920. Patton's last months with the Tank Corps, before the transfer back to cavalry becomes official, he spends the time running experiments with another tank-obsessed officer, Major Dwight Eisenhower, testing how fast tanks can move cross-country, how well they cooperate with infantry and artillery, how they might be used in independent operations. They race tanks through the Maryland countryside, tearing up terrain and burning through fuel, trying to prove that tanks can be something more than infantry support weapons. They write papers together, arguing for an independent tank force modelled on cavalry principles: speed, shock, exploitation. The War Department issues an official reprimand, orders them to stop wasting resources on unauthorised experiments, reminds them that tanks belong to the infantry and will be used exclusively for infantry support at walking speed. Eisenhower reads the reprimand and complies immediately, understanding that further resistance is career suicide. Patton reads it and wants to continue anyway, but Beatrice talks him down. "You can't fight them if you're cashiered," she tells him. "Wait. Your time will come." So Patton waits and watches and reads everything he can find about German tank development, because the Germans are having the same debate except they're reaching different conclusions. Fort Riley, Kansas. September 1922. The tank era is officially over. Patton stands in formation watching the Tank Corps colours being lowered for the last time, the unit officially disbanded, its personnel and equipment scattered to infantry units across the army. He is 36 years old, a major again after his temporary wartime rank of colonel expired, returning to the cavalry he left 6 years earlier. His service record shows temporary duty commanding tanks, but his permanent branch remains cavalry. His efficiency reports describe him as an excellent cavalry officer. His personnel file contains no mention of the tactical theories he developed, or the after-action reports he wrote, or the vision of mechanized warfare he articulated. The institutional army has decided that World War I proved cavalry obsolete, and tanks are just another infantry weapon. Patton knows they're exactly wrong. Cavalry is obsolete, but the principles of cavalry, warfare, speed, and shock and exploitation, are more relevant than ever when applied to machines instead of horses. But he can't say this out loud without destroying his career. So he stays silent. He writes his theories in journal articles, published in the Cavalry Journal, camouflaging his tank advocacy as articles about cavalry tactics that just happen to mention mechanized equipment. He keeps learning, he keeps studying. He keeps waiting for the war that will prove he was right all along. The tragedy of the interwar years is that America had a man who understood exactly how the next war would be fought, and the army systematically prevented him from preparing for it. Patton published a paper in 1920 titled "Tanks in Future Wars" that predicted massed armoured formations, combined arms warfare, and the decisive importance of speed and surprise. The army buried it. He tried to stay involved in tank development through the cavalry's mechanization program, but cavalry officers were more interested in preserving their traditions than embracing new weapons. Meanwhile, in Germany, An obscure officer named Heinz Guderian was reading French and British tank theory, studying Patton's published articles, and developing the Blitzkrieg doctrine that would conquer Poland and France in a matter of weeks. The Germans had 20 officers studying tank warfare in the 1920s. America had 0 funded programs. When World War II began in September 1939, the German army had refined armoured warfare into an art form. The American army was still debating whether tanks should operate in units larger than a platoon. Patton had been right in 1918. He had been ignored for 20 years. And America would pay for that institutional blindness with hundreds of thousands of casualties in battles that a properly mechanised army might have won faster and cheaper. The warrior who saw the future had been forced to pretend he didn't, to protect a career he needed to survive long enough to prove his vision correct. The boy who believed he was destined for greatness was learning that institutions destroy prophets who speak too soon. Fort Myer, Virginia, June 7, 1924. Captain George Patton, now back to his permanent rank after all wartime promotions expired, performs ceremonial cavalry demonstrations for Washington society on the manicured parade grounds outside the Capitol. His unit executes mounted drill movements, sabers flashing in the afternoon sun, horses perfectly trained to perform intricate maneuvers that have no combat value whatsoever. Wealthy spectators applaud from grandstands, congressmen's wives comment on how handsome the cavalry looks, and Patton smiles and accepts compliments while dying inside. He is 38 years old, one of the most tactically innovative officers America produced in World War I, and he's performing circus tricks for politicians. At night, in quarters, he shares with Beatrice. He reads smuggled copies of German military journals that discuss tank tactics and armoured warfare theory. He reads everything Guderian publishes, every article from the British Royal Tank Corps Journal, every French analysis of mechanised operations. He's learning everything about the future of warfare while being paid to preserve the obsolete past. The Germans are preparing for the next war. Patton is preparing to be ready when America finally admits the next war is coming. The interwar years demand a different kind of survival than combat. In battle, Patton knows how to excel. Lead from the front, take risks, push harder than anyone else. But in peacetime military service, especially during the Army's contraction from wartime millions to peacetime thousands, survival means political skill, social networking, cultivating powerful sponsors, avoiding controversy. Patton is spectacularly bad at most of this. He offends superiors with his arrogance, alienates peers with his self-promotion, makes enemies through sheer tactlessness, but he has 2 crucial advantages that save his career: money and mentorship. Beatrice's wealth means Patton can afford to host dinners for senior officers, travel to observe foreign armies on his own time, pursue expensive hobbies like polo that keep him connected to the Army's social elite. And he has cultivated a powerful patron, General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, now Army Chief of Staff. Pershing remembers Patton's tank operations at Meuse-Argonne, remembers his tactical innovation, remembers his physical courage. When Patton's career seems stalled, Pershing intervenes with quiet words to promotion boards, key assignments that keep Patton visible. Patton's survival through the 1920s and 30s isn't just persistence, it's strategic careering, using wealth and connections to remain relevant despite institutional indifference to his ideas. Washington, D.C., July 28, 1932. A very different kind of battle. Approximately 43,000 World War I veterans, the so-called Bonus Army, have camped in the capital demanding early payment of bonuses promised to them but not due until 1945. They've built a shantytown across the Anacostia River, brought their families, and refused to leave until Congress pays them. The Depression has destroyed their lives, and they want the money they earned fighting in France. President Hoover orders the army to evict them. Major Patton, now serving with the 3rd Cavalry at Fort Myer, leads his cavalry troops in the assault. The cavalry charges with drawn sabres, infantry uses tear gas, tanks, the same Renault FT-17 models Patton commanded in France, crush the veterans' shacks under their tracks. 4 people die, over 1,000 injured, the camp burns. Patton later justifies the action as necessary to prevent communist revolution, claiming the Bonus Army was infiltrated by agitators intent on overthrowing the government. Most historians consider this delusional paranoia, seeing instead desperate veterans seeking help during economic catastrophe. but Patton's willingness to use force against American citizens impresses his superiors. He gets promoted to lieutenant colonel. The lesson he learns is dark and dangerous. Obeying orders without question, even morally troubling orders, advances careers. Hesitation and moral complexity do not. The bonus army incident reveals something essential about Patton's character that will resurface repeatedly. He divides the world into the strong and the weak, the disciplined and the undisciplined, those who maintain order and those who threaten it. He has no middle ground, no room for moral ambiguity. The bonus army veterans were soldiers he should have sympathized with, men who served in the same war he fought, but Patton saw them as rabble threatening American civilization. This binary thinking, order versus chaos, discipline versus weakness, will make him an extraordinarily effective combat commander who drives his troops beyond normal human limits. It will also make him catastrophically ineffective at any task requiring nuance, political sensitivity, or understanding that not all problems are solved through force. The same personality that will make him brilliant at armoured warfare in 1944 will make him disastrous at military government in 1945. He is being forged into a perfect weapon for a specific purpose: offensive combat operations. But weapons don't govern. Weapons don't negotiate. Weapons don't occupy. And the army is about to promote a man who has become a human weapon, superbly adapted for one mission and completely unsuited for any other. Honolulu, Hawaii, March 1935. Lieutenant Colonel Patton serves as G2, intelligence officer, for the Hawaiian Division, probably the most obscure and frustrating assignment of his career. He's 49 years old, still a lieutenant colonel after holding that rank for 3 years, watching younger officers with less combat experience get promoted past him. Hawaii is beautiful. Hawaii is also military exile, thousands of miles from Washington. Power centers where careers are made. But Patton does what he always does. He studies. He creates defensive plans for Hawaii against possible Japanese attack, gaming out how an enemy might assault the islands. He identifies Pearl Harbor as the obvious first target, predicts that Japan would strike there with carrier-based aircraft to destroy the Pacific Fleet before it can sortie, recommends dispersing aircraft and ships to prevent them from being destroyed on the ground. His analysis is detailed, accurate, and filed away by staff officers who consider Japanese attack on Hawaii absurd paranoia. 6 years later, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft will attack Pearl Harbor using exactly the plan Patton predicted, destroying much of the Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,000 Americans. Patton's report will be found in the archives, stamped, filed, and forgotten. He was right. He was ignored. The Patton continues. Fort Clark, Texas, August 1938. Patton is now 53 years old, finally promoted to colonel after 16 years as lieutenant colonel, commanding a cavalry regiment on the Mexican border. It's the kind of command that marks the end of a career, not a launching point for higher things. Europe is collapsing into war. Germany has just annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and newsreels show German tanks rolling through Vienna while crowds cheer. Patton watches the footage obsessively, studying how the Germans use their armour, noting the speed of their advance, the coordination between tanks and mechanized infantry. He hosts dinner parties where he buttonholes guests and explains how America is completely unprepared for mechanized warfare, how the Germans are going to conquer Europe, how the U.S. Army is still preparing to fight World War I, while Germany is inventing World War II. His guests smile politely and think he's become an obsessive crank. We're going to lose the next war in its first 6 months. Patton tells anyone who will listen because no one will listen. He's not wrong. But saying "I told you so" in advance doesn't help when nobody believes you. May 10, 1940, Patton sits in a Fort Benning, Georgia movie theatre watching newsreel footage of the German invasion of France. The theatre is mostly empty, mid-morning screening, but Patton has come specifically to see the war footage. The newsreels show German panzer divisions racing across France at 40 miles per day, punching through the Maginot Line's flank, reaching the English Channel in 10 days. The French army, considered the most powerful in Europe, is collapsing in real time. The British Expeditionary Force is being pushed back to Dunkirk for desperate evacuation. Everything Patton predicted in 1920 is happening on screen. The German tanks are using tactics almost identical to those he outlined in his Meuse-Argonne after-action reports. The concentrated armoured formations, The rapid exploitation, the disruption of rear areas, the psychological shock, it's all there. Patton watches with a mixture of vindication and fury. He was right. He told them. He wrote it down. He published it. And the army ignored him for 20 years. Now France is falling in 6 weeks, and America has a grand total of approximately 400 obsolete tanks, none organized into armored divisions, commanded by officers with no training in mechanized warfare. The wilderness years are ending, war is coming, and Patton, now 54 years old, has one last chance to prove he was right all along. Fort Benning becomes the Army's Armoured Force School in the summer of 1940, finally creating the institutional structure for tank warfare that Patton advocated in 1920. The cavalry's horse-drawn regiments are being converted to mechanized cavalry, infantry divisions are receiving tank battalions, and crucially, the Army is creating independent armoured divisions capable of the kind of deep operations Patton has studied for decades. He receives orders to the 2nd Armoured Division as a brigade commander, his first armoured command since 1918. At 54, he's old for a brigade commander, but he's also the Army's most experienced tank officer, despite having served in cavalry for 20 years. The younger officers training at Fort Benning listen to him lecture on tank tactics with a mixture of awe and confusion. He tells them about Meuse-Argonne, about his experiments with Eisenhower at Camp Meade, about his study of German doctrine. He tells them they're going to have to relearn everything they think they know about warfare. Speed will matter more than firepower. Surprise will matter more than strength. Momentum will matter more than consolidation. We will win the coming war, Patton tells his students, by moving so fast the enemy can't react. We will win by being more violent, more aggressive, and more willing to take risks than any army in history. We will win because I've spent 20 years preparing for this, and now you're going to learn everything I know in 6 months. July 1941. Patton is now a Major General, commanding the 2nd Armoured Division, promoted 2 grades in 13 months, finally escaping the career stagnation that plagued him through the 1920s and 30s. The 2nd Armoured conducts manoeuvres in Tennessee and Louisiana, massive exercises involving hundreds of thousands of troops simulating combat operations. Patton's division moves faster and strikes harder than any other unit, overwhelming opposing forces through speed and aggression. He drives his tank commanders relentlessly, accepting no excuses, demanding they maintain offensive tempo even when exhausted. Critics call him reckless. Umpires penalize him for ignoring simulated casualties. But Patton's superiors notice something important. His division achieves objectives faster and with greater decisiveness than more cautious commanders. When war comes, the army will need aggressive commanders who understand mechanized warfare. After 20 years in the wilderness, Patton is finally becoming what he always believed he was destined to be. The boy who listened to Homer in his grandfather's library is about to become the man who terrorizes the German army. The officer who spent decades being ignored is about to become impossible to ignore. The destiny he felt so certain about is finally arriving. He just needs a war. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. February 14 to 22, 1943. The first major engagement between American and German forces in World War II is not going well. Rommel's Afrika Korps smashes through the American Second Corps positions, exploiting inexperienced leadership and poor coordination, driving American forces back over 50 miles in 5 days. German tanks punch through defenses designed to stop them. American infantry breaks and runs from positions they're supposed to hold. Artillery batteries are overrun before they can effectively engage. Radio discipline collapses into confused chatter. Officers lose track of their units. The Second Corps, approximately 30,000 men with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, dissolves into organized chaos. By February 22, American forces have suffered over 6,000 casualties, abandoned hundreds of vehicles and dozens of artillery pieces, and retreated to defensive positions near Tebessa. The American press treats it as a humiliating defeat. German propaganda proclaims American soldiers are cowards who can't fight. Rommel reports to Berlin that American troops lack combat discipline and aggressive leadership. He's not wrong, but he's about to meet someone who will make him revise that assessment. General Dwight Eisenhower faces a crisis. The North African campaign was supposed to demonstrate that American forces could fight effectively against the Wehrmacht, but Kasserine Pass has suggested the opposite. Allied unity requires American combat effectiveness. If US troops can't hold their sector, the entire theatre strategy collapses. The Second Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, has lost the confidence of both his subordinates and his superiors. Eisenhower needs someone who can restore the Second Corps' fighting spirit, someone who understands how to lead demoralized troops, someone who won't tolerate the kind of confusion and retreat that defined Kasserine. On March 6, 1943, Eisenhower calls George Patton, currently commanding the 1st Armoured Corps in Morocco, preparing for the Sicily invasion. "Georgie," Eisenhower says, "I need you to take 2nd Corps and fix it. You've got 1 month before we attack toward Gafsa. Do whatever you have to do." Patton hangs up and smiles. This is what he's been waiting for his entire career. A broken army to rebuild, an enemy to attack, and permission to use any methods necessary. The wilderness years are officially over. March 6, 1943, 2 p.m. Patton's staff car, a Dodge command vehicle, rolls through the 2nd Corps headquarters area near Jebel Kouif. The car stops and Patton emerges like an actor taking the stage. He's wearing a custom-tailored uniform that costs more than most soldiers earn in 3 months, polished boots that shine like mirrors, a lacquered helmet liner painted with 3 stars, and his ivory-handled Colt 45 and Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum revolvers in a custom leather holster rig. He looks like he's dressed for a parade, not a headquarters that just suffered a devastating defeat. Staff officers stare. Enlisted men stop what they're doing to watch. Patton surveys the scene, and his expression hardens into the war face he's been practicing since 1909. "Get your goddamn helmet on." He snarls at a passing soldier whose helmet is hanging from his pack. The soldier fumbles to comply. Patton turns to his Praded aide and says, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I'm here to restore discipline and fighting spirit. Every soldier in this corps will look like a soldier, act like a soldier, and fight like a soldier, or I'll court-martial him personally." Within 24 hours, 2nd Corps headquarters is flooded with new regulations. Helmets mandatory at all times, even in rear areas, neckties required for all officers, $50 fines for uniform violations, surprise inspections of every unit. Soldiers who just retreated from Kasserine under German fire are suddenly more worried about Patton than about Rommel. Patton's approach seems insane to officers who think the Corps needs tactical training, better intelligence, improved logistics. Why is he obsessing about uniform regulations when the real problem is combat effectiveness? But Patton understands something about military psychology that his critics don't. Beaten soldiers don't just need training, they need to believe they're not beaten. Soldiers who look like retreating rabble will continue to act like retreating rabble. But soldiers who are forced to maintain discipline in their appearance will start to internalize that discipline in their combat behavior. Patton is conducting psychological warfare against his own troops, using visible discipline to reconstruct their self-image. A man who is neat in appearance and military bearing is neat in thinking. Patton tells his officers, "A man who thinks clearly will fight effectively. I don't care if they hate me as long as they look like soldiers again." Within a week, the 2nd Corps starts to look different. Soldiers wear helmets, officers wear ties. Vehicles are camouflaged properly. Defensive positions are dug deeper. The outward signs of military order create inner discipline. Critics still mock Patton's methods, calling them theatrical and superficial. But the 2nd Corps is starting to believe it's an effective fighting force again. March 17, 1943, Battle of Gafsa. Patton launches the 2nd Corps' first offensive operation under his command, 11 days after taking over, attacking the town of Gafsa, which Rommel's forces captured during their Kasserine offensive. The operation is conceived as a limited attack to test the Corps' combat readiness, but Patton treats it as a full-scale assault. He positions himself forward where he can observe the attack personally, deliberately exposing himself to German artillery fire. When one of his staff officers suggests he should command from a safer position, Patton responds, "I can't ask men to go where I won't go myself." The attack goes smoothly. German forces, thinly stretched defending their gains from Kasserine, withdraw after light resistance. American forces recapture Gafsa in 48 hours, taking relatively light casualties. Patton immediately calls war correspondents to the front and tells them, "The Germans are running, we've got them now, 2nd Corps is back in the fight." It's propaganda, and everyone knows it. A minor tactical success inflated into a major victory. but propaganda has military value. German intelligence reports note increased American aggressiveness. British commanders note improved Second Corps performance. Most importantly, Second Corps soldiers start believing they can beat the Germans. March 23, 1943. Battle of El Geta, the real test. Second Corps attacks toward El Goeta, facing the German 10th Panzer Division, approximately 90 tanks with supporting infantry and artillery. This isn't a limited raid against thinly held positions. This is a major engagement against elite German armour. Patton positions himself at a forward observation post where he can see the battle develop, binoculars in hand, radio headset connecting him to his tank commanders. The Germans launch a counterattack, trying to smash through the American positions with concentrated armour. Patton watches German tanks advancing across open ground and starts issuing fire commands directly to his tank destroyer battalions, bypassing normal chain of command, directing fire like he's commanding individual guns. His staff is horrified by his micromanagement, but his tank destroyers start killing German tanks at an extraordinary rate. The M10 tank destroyers, armed with 3-inch guns, engage the German Mark IV tanks at ranges beyond 2,000 yards. By the end of the day, the 10th Panzer Division has lost over 30 tanks, 35 half-tracks, and suffered more than 400 casualties. The Americans lose 7 tanks. It's the first significant American armour victory in the European theatre. Patton tells correspondents, "The Krauts are learning that American armour can fight. Tell Rommel we're coming for him." But even in victory, Patton sees the politics working against him. He's been given Second Corps temporarily to restore its combat effectiveness. Not as a permanent command. General Omar Bradley, his former subordinate from his World War I Tank Corps days, is already being groomed to take over Second Corps for the Sicily invasion. Eisenhower likes Bradley. Steady, tactful, politically skilled, gets along with British commanders. Eisenhower respects Patton's tactical brilliance, but distrusts his volatility, his self-promotion, his tendency to create diplomatic incidents. On April 15, Patton writes in his diary, "Bradley will get the glory. Ike needs someone safe. I'm too dangerous, too successful, too visible. They'll sideline me again." It's paranoid. It's also accurate. Despite restoring Second Corps' combat effectiveness in just 44 days, despite achieving the first American armour victory against the Germans, despite transforming a defeated force into an aggressive one, Patton will be relieved of command. Bradley will lead Second Corps into Sicily. Patton will command 7th Army, a new formation, in the same invasion. On paper, it's a promotion, Army Command versus Corps Command. In practice, it's a lateral move that keeps Patton from commanding the unit he rebuilt. The pattern from the wilderness years continues. Military success followed by institutional sidelining. Patton sees it coming and can do nothing to prevent it. The Second Corps experience teaches everyone, including the Germans, several crucial lessons. First, American soldiers can fight effectively when properly led. The same troops who broke at Kasserine held and attacked at El Geta. The difference was leadership and training, not inherent quality. Second, Patton's theatrical command style, however eccentric, produces results. The uniform regulations and visible discipline created psychological effects that translated to combat effectiveness. Third, American armor tactics are improving rapidly. The tank destroyer doctrine that American officers developed is working, allowing lighter American vehicles to defeat heavier German tanks through better tactics and gunnery. Fourth, and most ominously for the Germans, this Patton character is going to be a problem. German intelligence officers compile reports on Allied commanders, trying to identify which ones pose the greatest threat. The assessments of Montgomery are mixed, stubborn, predictable, methodical. The assessments of Bradley are cautious, competent, but unimaginative. The assessments of Patton are unanimous, aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. Wehrmacht units start recognizing which sector Patton commands by the style of American operations. Faster attacks, deeper penetrations, more violent combat. Rommel's intelligence officers add Patton to the list of Allied commanders who require special attention. May 7, 1943. Axis forces in Tunisia surrender, ending the North African campaign. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers become prisoners, a catastrophic defeat for Germany and Italy, opening the Mediterranean for Allied shipping and setting the stage for the invasion of Sicily. Patton's Second Corps participated in the final offensive, performing credibly achieving objectives on schedule. The turnaround from Kasserine to victory in less than 3 months is remarkable. But Patton gets little credit in the press, which focuses on Montgomery's 8th Army and its advance from Egypt. Patton returns to Morocco to prepare for Sicily, already planning how he'll use 7th Army in the coming invasion, already competing with Montgomery in his imagination. His chief of staff asks him what he hopes to achieve in Sicily. "I'm going to beat Monty to Messina," Patton says. "I'm going to show everyone that American forces can move faster and fight harder than the British. I'm going to prove that speed and aggression win battles." His staff exchanges worried looks. The mission in Sicily is to capture the island and secure Allied control of the Mediterranean, not to race Montgomery for personal glory. But Patton doesn't see a distinction between victory and his personal vindication. He spent 25 years being ignored, sidelined, and underestimated. Sicily is his chance to prove, once and for all, that his theories about mechanized warfare are correct. He just needs to move fast enough and hit hard enough that no one can deny his success. And nothing, absolutely nothing, is going to slow him down. Gela, Sicily, July 10, 1943, 03:45 hours. The pre-dawn darkness explodes, with the flash of naval guns firing from offshore, shells screaming over Patton's 7th Army invasion beaches, pounding German and Italian defensive positions. Patton stands on the bridge of the USS Monrovia, watching the barrage, waiting for first light to go ashore. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, involves 160,000 men assaulting across 26 beaches, the largest amphibious operation yet attempted. Montgomery's British 8th Army lands on the island's eastern coast, tasked with driving north to Messina. Patton's 7th Army lands on the southern coast near Gela and Scogliti, tasked with protecting Montgomery's flank and capturing western Sicily. On paper, Patton has the secondary role, the supporting mission, but Patton sees an opportunity. If he can move fast enough, if he can break out from the beaches and race across the island, if he can reach Messina before Montgomery, he'll prove that American mobility and aggression can defeat British methodical preparation. The invasion is beginning, the race is starting, and Patton has no intention of coming in second. The landing at Gela goes badly. The beachhead is only a few hundred yards deep when the Hermann Göring Panzer Division launches a counterattack at 10 a.m., 25 German Mark IV tanks crashing into the American positions, trying to drive the invasion force back into the sea. American infantry armed with bazookas and anti-tank guns engage the panzers at close range, but the German armour has momentum, pushing forward, threatening to break through. If the panzers reach the beach, they can enfilade the landing zones, turn the invasion into a slaughter. Patton, who came ashore at 9 a.m. against his staff's advice, appears at the most threatened sector, carrying his radio and calling fire missions directly to the Navy. All ships, he transmits, commence firing on coordinates. He reads map coordinates identifying the German tank positions. The naval guns, 6-inch and 8-inch rifles on cruisers and destroyers offshore, shift fire. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds start landing on the German armour with devastating accuracy. The Hermann Göring Division's counterattack shatters under the naval bombardment, tanks destroyed, infantry pinned down. By noon, the beachhead is secure. Patton has been ashore for 3 hours and has already personally directed the naval fire that saved the invasion. His staff is terrified he'll get killed. His soldiers start to believe they're following a commander who can see the entire battlefield and respond instantly to any crisis. July 22, 1943, Palermo. While Montgomery grinds forward against German resistance at Catania on the eastern coast, Patton has taken a calculated risk. He swung his entire army west, away from Montgomery, driving along the northern coast of Sicily toward Palermo, the island's capital. It's not the mission he was assigned. He was supposed to protect Montgomery's flank, remain in supporting position, advance only as British 8th Army advanced, but Patton argued to Eisenhower that capturing Palermo would cut off Axis forces in western Sicily, give the Allies a major port for supplies, and demonstrate American operational capability. Eisenhower reluctantly approved, probably because denying Patton would create endless argument. Now Patton's forces raced toward Palermo, covering 100 miles in 4 days, far faster than anyone thought possible on Sicily's mountain roads. The 3rd Infantry Division, led by Major General Lucien Truscott, advances so quickly that Italian garrisons surrender rather than face American armour. On July 22, Patton enters Palermo in triumph, capturing the city with minimal fighting, taking thousands of Italian prisoners. The newspapers back home proclaim Patton beats Monty to Palermo. Montgomery is still fighting toward Catania. Patton is already planning his next move, a drive east along the northern coast to Messina, setting up the race that will define the Sicily campaign. The race to Messina becomes an obsession for Patton. Montgomery's 8th Army is advancing up the eastern coast, Route 1, the obvious and direct approach. But the Germans have concentrated their defence on that axis, creating strong positions that slow British advance to a few miles per day. Patton's northern coastal route, Highway 113, is supposed to be the secondary axis, but it's less heavily defended because the Germans didn't think the Americans would push along such difficult terrain. Patton sees his chance. If he can move faster than the terrain should allow, if he can drive his troops beyond normal limits, if he can reach Messina before Montgomery, it will prove that American forces under aggressive leadership can outperform British forces under cautious leadership. It becomes personal. Patton starts measuring progress in hours, not days. When units report they need to pause for rest or resupply, he relieves commanders and pushes forward anyway. When German positions block the coastal road, he orders amphibious end runs, loading troops on landing craft and bypassing German defences by landing behind them. The 3rd Infantry Division starts calling him Georgie the Driver, because he's constantly appearing at the front, demanding faster progress. How soon can you attack? Becomes his standard question, followed by, not good enough. Attack now. August 3, 1943. 15th Evacuation Hospital near Sant'Agata di Militello. The hospitals behind the 7th Army's advancing front are filling with casualties. Soldiers wounded by German artillery and small arms fire, men with shrapnel wounds and bullet holes, the normal toll of combat operations. But there are also soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, what later wars will call combat stress or PTSD, the psychological breakdown that occurs when men are pushed beyond their mental limits. Patton visits the hospitals regularly, believing his presence boosts morale, showing wounded men that their commander cares about them. But when Patton encounters Private Charles Cool, a 26-year-old infantryman sitting on a cot with no visible wounds, something inside Patton snaps. What's wrong with you? Patton demands. Cool, says he, can't take it anymore that his nerves are shot. Patton sees a coward, a man shirking duty while others die. He slaps Cool across the face with his gloves, screams, "You goddamn coward! Get back to the front!" and threatens to shoot him. Medical staff and other patients watch in horror. Patton storms out, believing he's motivated a malingerer to return to duty. He's actually just committed the act that will nearly destroy his career. August 10, 1943. 93rd Evacuation Hospital, near San Stefano. Patton does it again. He encounters Private Paul Bennett, an artilleryman hospitalized for anxiety, and the scene from the 15th Hospital repeats with even more violence. Patton slaps Bennett, knocking his helmet liner off, draws his pistol and waves it in Bennett's face while screaming about cowardice, threatens to shoot him on the spot. Doctors and nurses intervene, getting between Patton and the terrified soldier. Patton leaves, still convinced he's enforcing discipline. Medical staff immediately begin writing reports up the chain of command. The reports reach General Omar Bradley, now commanding 2nd Corps under Patton's 7th Army. Bradley reads them and feels sick. What Patton has done is criminal assault, a court-martial offence, grounds for immediate relief and probably end of career. Bradley forwards the reports to Eisenhower, adding his own assessment. Patton's value as a combat commander must be weighed against his liability as a leader who assaults enlisted men. Eisenhower receives the reports on August 16 and faces the hardest decision of the campaign. Patton has just achieved the most successful American ground operation of the war so far. He's also assaulted 2 soldiers suffering genuine psychiatric trauma. What do you do with a brilliant general who commits crimes? August 17, 1943, 10:30 a.m. Messina. Lead elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division enter Messina, beating British 8th Army by several hours. Winning the race, Patton made the focus of the entire campaign. Patton arrives shortly after touring the city, accepting the surrender of Italian forces, posing for photographs with the American flag over Messina. He's triumphant, vindicated, proven right about aggressive American operations. The Sicily campaign took 38 days. instead of the predicted 90. American forces covered over 200 miles, captured half the island, inflicted 29,000 casualties on Axis forces while sustaining 7,500 killed and wounded. It's a stunning operational success. Validation of everything Patton believes about mechanized warfare. The newspapers proclaim him a military genius. His soldiers celebrate the victory. And at Supreme Allied Headquarters, Dwight Eisenhower is reading medical reports about the slapping incidents and trying to decide whether to court-martial America's most successful combat commander. Eisenhower's decision is political calculation wrapped in military necessity. Patton is too valuable to lose, too effective at aggressive operations that the Allies desperately need as they plan the invasion of mainland Europe. But the slapping incidents are indefensible, morally wrong, and potentially criminal. Eisenhower's solution is characteristic: private punishment, public protection. On August 20, he writes Patton a scathing letter ordering him to apologize personally to Cool and Bennett, to apologize to all medical staff who witnessed the incidents, and to apologize to every division in 7th Army. I am seriously contemplating official action on your case. Eisenhower writes, if you cannot control your temper, I will have no choice but to relieve you. Patton, who has just achieved the greatest victory of his career, receives the letter and realizes his career is hanging by a thread. He makes the apologies, humiliating himself before thousands of soldiers, admitting he was wrong. The press doesn't find out. Eisenhower suppresses the story, believing it would damage morale and Allied unity. Patton remains in command, but he's no longer being considered for major commands in the coming invasions of Italy and France. The slapping incidents have labelled him as unstable, unreliable, dangerous. His greatest triumph has coincided with his effective demotion. He doesn't know it yet, but he won't command troops in combat for another 11 months. The wilderness is returning. The Sicily campaign's legacy is complex and contradictory. Militarily, it was an extraordinary success. The Allies secured the island in just over a month, opened the Mediterranean to shipping, forced Italy toward surrender, demonstrated that amphibious operations could succeed against prepared defences. Patton's aggressive leadership drove 7th Army to achieve objectives faster than anyone predicted. The race to Messina, while militarily unnecessary, proved that American mobility could match or exceed British performance. German commanders learned that American forces, when aggressively led, were formidable opponents who couldn't be dismissed as inexperienced amateurs. But the campaign also revealed Patton's fundamental flaw: his inability to understand the difference between toughness and cruelty, between demanding excellence and committing abuse. The slapping incidents weren't aberrations. They were the logical extension of Patton's belief that warriors must be harder than their enemies, that compassion is weakness, that psychological casualties are cowards to be shamed into fighting. Modern medicine understands combat stress as a normal response to extreme trauma, treatable with rest and support. Patton saw it as moral failure requiring punishment. He was absolutely wrong, and his wrongness on this issue would eventually destroy his career more effectively than any German could have done. The warrior who spent his life preparing for greatness couldn't comprehend that greatness requires wisdom as well as courage, judgment as well as aggression, compassion as well as strength. He had the courage and aggression, he lacked the rest, and Sicily revealed that lack to everyone who mattered. Knutsford, England, April 25, 1944. A small English town's welcome club has invited General Patton to speak at their opening ceremony, a minor social event that should have been routine diplomatic courtesy. Approximately 60 people crowd into the modest hall, mostly local women organising charitable work for American soldiers stationed nearby. Patton stands at the podium and makes offhand remarks about Anglo-American relations, saying something about how Britain and America are destined to rule the world after the war. He doesn't mention the Soviet Union. Someone writes down his words. A reporter hears about the speech. Within 48 hours, newspapers across America and Britain are running headlines about Patton's diplomatic gaffe, his apparent dismissal of Allied unity, his suggestion that the Soviets don't matter. Congressional representatives demand his dismissal. Soviet officials file formal protests. Eisenhower, who spent months protecting Patton after the slapping incidents, seriously considers court-martial. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, tells Eisenhower that Patton's value doesn't outweigh his constant generation of political crises. Patton, who was already sidelined from D-Day command, now faces complete career termination. He writes in his diary, I am apparently a slave of fate. The Knutsford speech represents Patton at his worst. Undisciplined, politically tone-deaf, unable to understand that words have consequences beyond their speaker's intentions. But it also reveals the impossible position Patton occupies in the Allied command structure. He's considered the most aggressive and effective American ground commander. The officer German intelligence identifies as the greatest threat, yet he's not trusted to command the D-Day invasion because Eisenhower and Marshall believe he can't be controlled. Instead, Omar Bradley, Patton's former subordinate, will command all American ground forces in Normandy. Patton has been assigned to command 1st United States Army Group, supposedly preparing in southeast England for the invasion. The problem is that 1st United States Army Group doesn't exist. It's a fiction, an elaborate deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the Allies will invade at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Patton is commanding a phantom army of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. His punishment for success in Sicily and his reward for surviving the slapping scandal is being made the centerpiece of history's largest deception operation. He doesn't yet understand that this humiliating assignment will become his most important contribution to Allied victory. Dover, England, May 1944. Patton stands in a field inspecting what appears to be an American tank battalion. Rows of Sherman tanks parked in organized formations, camouflage netting draped over them, tire tracks in the mud showing recent movement. Patton walks closer and pushes against one of the tanks. It bounces slightly. He pulls out a pocket knife and jabs it into the tank's hull. The knife punctures the armor easily because the tank is made of inflatable rubber stretched over a wooden frame. The entire battalion consists of rubber and canvas, sophisticated props that from the air look exactly like real armoured vehicles. British deception officers explain the operation to Patton. FUSAG, 1st United States Army Group, exists only as a collection of fake equipment, carefully controlled radio transmissions, and double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. The Germans believe FUSAG is real because Patton commands it, and German intelligence has concluded that the Allies would never waste their best commander on a diversionary force. Therefore, wherever Patton concentrates, his forces must be the main invasion point. By positioning FUSAG in southeast England, opposite Pas-de-Calais, the Allies are convincing Hitler that the real invasion will strike there, not at Normandy. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, is staggeringly complex and dependent entirely on German respect for Patton's abilities. British intelligence controls several German agents operating in Britain, feeding them carefully crafted false information about Allied invasion plans. These double agents report FUSAG's build-up, describing Patton's inspections, counting fake divisions, observing phantom landing craft. German intelligence in Berlin receives these reports and believes them because they fit German assessments of Allied capabilities and intentions. The Germans have been tracking Patton since North Africa, studying his operational methods, rating him as the most dangerous Allied ground commander. Wehrmacht intelligence officers have concluded that Patton represents the greatest threat to German forces, that his style of aggressive mechanized warfare most resembles German doctrine, that any major Allied offensive will certainly include Patton in a leading role. Therefore, Fortitude's success depends on this assessment. If the Germans believe Patton commands the main invasion force, they'll position their reserves to meet that invasion. By making Patton commander of a ghost army, the Allies are weaponizing German respect for his abilities against German defensive planning. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Patton is in England, not in France, while 156,000 Allied soldiers storm the Normandy beaches, while paratroopers drop behind German lines, while the largest amphibious invasion in history unfolds, Patton sits in his headquarters at Peover Hall reading status reports. Bradley commands the invasion. Montgomery commands the ground forces. Eisenhower commands the entire operation. Patton commands nothing real. His ghost army continues its deception mission, maintaining radio traffic, suggesting FUSAG is preparing for a second invasion at Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence continues to believe the Normandy landings are a diversion, that the real invasion is coming where Patton is positioned, that the Allies wouldn't commit Patton to a secondary operation. In fact, approximately 19 German divisions, including several panzer divisions, remain at Pas-de-Calais throughout June and into July, unable to reinforce Normandy because Hitler believes Patton's ghost army will attack at any moment. The success of D-Day and the subsequent breakout from Normandy owes something substantial to these immobilized German reserves. to the approximately 350,000 German soldiers frozen in place by a phantom army commanded by a general who isn't fighting. The irony would be funny if it weren't so painful for Patton. He spent his entire career preparing to command major operations, and now his greatest contribution to the Allied victory comes from not commanding anything. His reputation, earned through aggressive combat leadership in North Africa and Sicily, has been turned into a weapon that works precisely because he's not allowed to fight. German intelligence officers, who correctly assessed Patton as a dangerous opponent, make the logical error of assuming the Allies would use their best commander in their most important operation. They cannot imagine that Allied command politics would sideline Patton for disciplinary reasons, that the slapping incidents and the Knutsford speech have made him too controversial for major command despite his tactical brilliance. The Germans are fighting logically while the Allies are fighting politically, and somehow the political approach is working better. Patton writes bitter diary entries throughout June, watching the Normandy campaign unfold without him, knowing his phantom command is strategically valuable but personally humiliating. "I am being used as a decoy," he writes, "because I am too valuable to fire, but too dangerous to employ." July 6, 1944. Montgomery's forces are still fighting to capture Caen, a city that was supposed to fall on D-Day, now 30 days into the campaign. American forces have secured the Cotentin Peninsula and captured Cherbourg, but are bogged down in the Norman hedgerows, suffering heavy casualties for minimal territorial gains. The breakout from Normandy, which was supposed to happen within weeks, looks increasingly difficult. Eisenhower faces pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt to show progress, to demonstrate that the invasion is succeeding, to prove that the massive commitment of resources to the Normandy campaign will produce results. And sitting in England is Patton, the general who specialises in rapid advances and breakthrough operations, commanding an imaginary army. Eisenhower makes a decision. Patton will be brought to France, given command of Third Army, and unleashed once American forces achieve the breakout. But the timing is crucial. Patton must remain associated with Fusag long enough to keep German reserves at Pas-de-Calais until the breakout begins. Then he'll be transferred to operational command so quickly that the Germans won't have time to reposition before his real army starts moving. It's a calculated gamble that Fortitude's deception can be maintained just long enough for Patton's actual talents to be employed, where they'll cause maximum damage. The psychological toll on Patton during these months is severe. He's 58 years old, watching younger generals command the campaigns he trained his entire life to lead. He sees Bradley, his former subordinate, directing operations across Normandy. He watches Montgomery, his rival, dominate British strategy. He reads casualty reports from the hedgerow fighting and believes, probably correctly, that his aggressive approach would have achieved faster results with acceptable losses. But he can't say this publicly without appearing insubordinate. He can't advocate for different tactics without seeming to criticise the current commanders. He's trapped in a role that's strategically essential but personally degrading, knowing his phantom command is helping the real invasion succeed but unable to participate in that success. His diary entries become increasingly bitter, filled with frustration at what he sees as wasted potential. "They are using me to fool the Germans," he writes, "when they should be using me to kill them." He's not wrong, but he also doesn't fully appreciate that his contribution to D-Day's success, while indirect, may have been more valuable than any command role he could have played. Sometimes the greatest warriors serve best by not fighting, by being the threat that pins enemy forces in place while others strike elsewhere. It's a sophisticated strategic concept. Patton never fully accepts it. He wants to be Alexander leading the charge, not Odysseus crafting the trick. But history will remember both. August 1st, 1944, approaches. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, is about to begin. American forces will punch through German lines at Saint-Lô and race into open country, exploiting mobility and firepower advantages that have been negated by hedgerow fighting. And when the breakthrough occurs, Patton will finally return to combat command. Third Army will be activated and Patton will lead it through the gap that Cobra creates, driving deep into France, conducting exactly the kind of mobile warfare he's advocated since 1920. The Ghost Army commander is about to become real again. The Germans, who've been watching Patton's phantom force for months, are about to discover that while they were focused on what Patton might do at Pas-de-Calais, he's actually going to do it in France. The deception has worked perfectly. But for Patton, the deception is ending, and the real war is finally beginning. After 11 months in purgatory, After the slapping incidents and the Knutsford speech and the humiliation of commanding inflatable tanks, Patton is about to prove that everything people say about him, both positive and negative, is absolutely true. He is brilliant and dangerous, effective and unstable, the best American combat commander and the worst political operator. He is about to become exactly what the Germans feared, an armoured force commander with nothing to restrain him and a grudge to work off. Europe is about to meet the real George Patton. And nothing will ever be the same. Avranches, France. August 1, 1944. Midnight. Third Army officially activates with George Patton finally in combat command after 11 months of exile. Operation Cobra has blown open the German defensive line at Saint-Lô, creating a gap that American forces are exploiting, and Patton's Third Army is designated to pour through that gap and drive deep into France. But the gap is narrow, barely 3 miles wide, a single bridge over the Séluni River at Avranches serving as the bottleneck through which Patton must move his entire army. Third Army consists of approximately 150,000 men, 15,000 vehicles, and multiple armoured and infantry divisions that all need to pass through Avranches in the next 48 hours before German forces can counterattack and close the gap. Military doctrine says it's impossible to move that many troops through such a restricted passage that quickly. Patton's response to military doctrine is characteristically profane and unprintable. He positions military police at the bridge with orders to keep traffic moving continuously. No stops, no slowdowns, no excuses. Vehicles move bumper to bumper. Columns continue through darkness without headlights. When units try to pause for rest or maintenance, MPs push them forward. Patton himself appears at the bridge repeatedly throughout the night, standing in the middle of traffic, directing movement, screaming at anyone who creates delay. By August 3, his entire army has passed through Avranches. The Germans never managed to close the gap. The breakout is complete. August 8th, 1944. Brittany. Third Army spearheads, led by the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions, race west into the Brittany Peninsula, advancing 40 miles per day, far faster than even Patton's optimistic planning projected. The mission is to capture Brittany's ports, particularly Brest and Lorient, giving the Allies additional supply capacity for the armies building up in France. But the ports are less important than Patton realises, and Third Army's spectacular advance into Brittany is strategically questionable. The real opportunity lies to the east, where German forces are exposed and retreating, where aggressive pursuit could trap entire German armies. Bradley and Eisenhower begin to understand that Patton's movement toward Brittany, while achieving its stated objectives with impressive speed, is actually the wrong direction. But stopping Patton once he's moving is like trying to redirect a hurricane. His forces are advancing so fast they've outrun their supply lines, their communications, sometimes their own maps. Tank crews navigate using tourist guidebooks and pre-war Michelin roadmaps. Forward units run out of fuel and sit stationary until supply trucks catch up, then immediately resume the advance. Patton issues orders to bypass resistance and keep moving, creating isolated German garrisons that Third Army leaves behind for follow-on forces to mop up. It's not how armies are supposed to operate. It's also devastatingly effective. August 15th, 1944, Argentan. Bradley orders Patton to redirect Third Army from Brittany toward the east, where a massive opportunity is developing. German forces that were fighting in Normandy are attempting to retreat through a narrow corridor between American forces advancing from the west and British-Canadian forces advancing from the north. The corridor, approximately 15 miles wide between Argentan and Falaise, represents a potential killing ground where the entire German 7th Army could be trapped and destroyed. Patton's forces are approaching Argentan from the south. Montgomery's forces are approaching Falaise from the north. If they link up, they'll close the trap. Patton's lead units, elements of the 5th Armoured Division and the 79th Infantry Division, reach Argentan on August 13. Falaise is just 15 miles north. Patton can see the opportunity, push forward, close the gap, trap the Germans. He asks Bradley for permission to continue north past Argentan toward Falaise. Bradley refuses. The boundary between American and British zones runs through Argentan. Bradley doesn't want American forces crossing into Montgomery's operational area without coordination. Patton explodes. "Let me go on to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." It's vintage Patton, brilliant tactical insight, wrapped in offensive rhetoric that makes cooperation impossible. The Falaise Gap becomes one of World War II's great controversies and a bitter point of contention between Patton and Bradley for the rest of their lives. Bradley orders Third Army to halt at Argentan, waiting for Montgomery's forces to close from the north. But Montgomery's advance is slow, methodical, delayed by German resistance. The gap remains open for days. During that time, approximately 20,000 to 40,000 German soldiers escape eastward, troops and equipment that will reinforce German defences later in the war. Eventually, Canadian forces close the gap on August 21, but only after much of the German 7th Army has withdrawn. The pocket yields approximately 10,000 to 15,000 German dead and 50,000 prisoners, a significant victory but not the total destruction that might have been achieved. Patton argues for the rest of his life that Bradley's halt order at Argentan allowed tens of thousands of Germans to escape, that if Third Army had been allowed to continue north, they could have closed the gap days earlier. Bradley argues that Patton's advance would have created coordination chaos, that American and British forces advancing toward each other in meeting engagement would have inflicted massive friendly fire casualties, that the halt order prevented disaster. Both men are probably partially right, but the Falaise Gap reveals a fundamental tension in Allied strategy, whether to prioritise coordination and safety or speed and aggression. Patton always chooses speed. The army command structure always chooses coordination, and the war lasts longer as a result. August 25, 1944, Paris. The French 2nd Armoured Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc and attached to American forces, enters Paris in triumph, liberating the city after 4 years of German occupation. Crowds line the Champs-Élysées. Celebrations erupt throughout the city. Free French forces accept German surrender. It's one of the war's iconic moments, liberation of Europe's most symbolic city, psychological victory that announces Allied dominance. But Patton is not there. Third Army bypassed Paris days earlier, driving east while Leclerc's division turned north into the city. Patton's judgment is coldly military. Paris has no strategic value. Liberating. It consumes resources, better used for continuing the advance. Stopping for symbolic victories wastes the momentum that wins wars. I'm not interested in liberating Paris, he tells his staff. I'm interested in destroying German armies. We can liberate Paris after we defeat Germany. His assessment is strategically sound and emotionally tone-deaf, typical Patton, valuing military efficiency over political and psychological reality. Eisenhower understands that liberating Paris matters politically, that symbols and morale have strategic weight, that sometimes you fight for reasons beyond pure military logic. Patton understands only the advance, the destruction of enemy forces, the relentless offensive that ends wars. While others celebrate Paris, Patton's forces are already east of the city, racing toward the German frontier. September 1st, 1944, the Meuse River, eastern France. Third Army has advanced 400 miles in 30 days, the fastest sustained advance in modern military history, liberating virtually all of northern France, reaching the German frontier ahead of all predictions and planning. It's an operational triumph that validates everything Patton argued about mechanized warfare since 1920. Speed matters more than strength, momentum matters more than consolidation. Aggressive pursuit defeats enemies more effectively than methodical advance. Third Army has torn through France faster than the German army, conquered it in 1940, achieved in 1 month what took 4 years of fighting in World War I. Patton's divisions have captured 65,000 prisoners, killed or wounded approximately 65,000 more, destroyed or captured thousands of German vehicles and guns. Third Army's own casualties are approximately 16,000 killed and wounded, a favourable ratio achieved through speed that prevented Germans from organising effective defensive lines. But the advance has created a critical problem: logistics. Third Army requires approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel daily to maintain this operational tempo. By September 1st, Third Army is receiving approximately 32,000 gallons per day, an 8% supply rate. Patton's tanks are running dry. The Hurricane is sputtering to a halt, not from German resistance, but from empty gas tanks. The fuel crisis reveals the fundamental weakness of Third Army's spectacular advance. It succeeded too well, moved too fast, created supply problems that the Allied logistics system couldn't solve. The Normandy invasion was planned assuming Allied forces would require months to break out from the beachhead, that ports in Brittany would be captured and operational by the time armies reached eastern France, that supply lines would extend gradually as territory was secured. Instead, Third Army reached the German frontier in 30 days, hundreds of miles ahead of logistical planning assumptions. All supplies for Allied armies in France still flow through the Normandy beaches and the Mulberry artificial harbours, trucked forward along roads damaged by combat and congested with military traffic. The famous Red Ball Express, dedicated truck convoys running supplies from Normandy to the advancing armies, operates 24 hours daily but can't keep pace with Third Army's consumption. Eisenhower faces an impossible choice: distribute limited supplies equally among all Allied armies, slowing everyone but maintaining broad front pressure, or concentrate supplies on one army for a deep thrust that might end the war quickly but risks disaster if it fails. Patton demands concentration, arguing that Third Army can reach the Rhine River and penetrate into Germany if given fuel priority. Montgomery demands the same for British 21st Army Group, arguing for a northern thrust toward the Ruhr industrial region. Bradley wants to supply both American armies, 1st and 3rd, for a coordinated advance. Eisenhower chooses broad front approach, distributing limited supplies among multiple armies. It's the safe decision. It's also the decision that allows Germany to stabilize its defense and extend the war. September 5 through December 1944. Metz. Third Army's fuel starvation forces a transition from mobile warfare to siege warfare, exactly the kind of fighting Patton's entire doctrine is designed to avoid. The fortress city of Metz, ancient stronghold on the Moselle River, guards the approaches to Germany's Saar industrial region. The city's defences include 45 concrete forts built in the early 20th century, arranged in multiple defensive rings, garrisoned by approximately 37,000 German troops determined to hold. Patton's forces, unable to bypass Metz due to fuel shortages, must reduce the fortress through direct assault. The battle becomes grinding attrition, artillery bombardments followed by infantry assaults on prepared positions, casualties mounting for minimal territorial gains. It's the opposite of everything Patton believes about warfare. Static combat, reminiscent of World War I, exactly what mechanized warfare was supposed to prevent. Third Army requires 92 days to capture Metz, fighting from September through late November, sustaining approximately 47,000 casualties. The ratio of casualties to ground gained is worse than almost any Third Army operation during the August advance. Patton's genius lies in mobile exploitation warfare. At Metz, denied mobility by logistics, he's reduced to the same methodical attrition that any competent general could manage. The battle proves that Patton's methods require resources, that brilliant tactics can't overcome strategic constraints, that even the best offensive commander becomes ordinary when forced into siege warfare. Patton's private writings during the Metz campaign reveal his frustration and his growing bitterness toward Allied command decisions. "We could have been in Berlin by now, if they'd given me the gas," he writes in his diary, referring to the fuel allocation decisions in September. "Instead, we're butting our heads against concrete forts that we should have bypassed weeks ago." His assessment contains truth and exaggeration in equal measure. Third Army probably couldn't have reached Berlin in September. The distance was too great. German reserves were starting to organise effective defence, and supply problems would have become catastrophic. But Third Army almost certainly could have crossed the Rhine River and established bridgeheads in Germany if given fuel priority, potentially shortening the war by months. The counterfactual is unprovable but tantalising. What if Eisenhower had concentrated supplies on Third Army in September, accepted risk in other sectors, and let Patton drive into Germany while German defences were still disorganised? Would it have succeeded and ended the war in 1944? Would it have failed catastrophically, creating an overextended salient that Germans could cut off and destroy? History chose the cautious path. Patton wanted the aggressive path. And we'll never know which would have worked better. But we do know what actually happened. The war continued for 8 more months. Hundreds of thousands more people died. And Patton spent the fall of 1944 fighting the kind of battle he hated most, bleeding his army against fortifications that mobility should have rendered irrelevant. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. September 2, 1944. Eisenhower hosts a tense meeting with his top commanders, Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton. The topic is supply allocation and strategic direction now that Allied armies have reached the German frontier. Montgomery presents his plan for a concentrated thrust into northern Germany, arguing that a single powerful strike toward the Ruhr industrial region could end the war by Christmas. He wants priority for all available supplies, fuel, and reinforcements for British 21st Army Group and American 1st Army under his operational control. Patton counters with his own plan for Third Army to drive through the Saar region into central Germany, arguing that his forces have already demonstrated superior mobility and aggressive spirit. He wants the same supply priority Montgomery demands. The two generals argue past each other, neither willing to accept a supporting role, both demanding the starring part in ending the war. Bradley tries to mediate, suggesting both American armies should receive equal support. Eisenhower listens and makes his decision. Supplies will be distributed among all armies, maintaining broad front pressure on Germany, refusing to concentrate resources on any single thrust. Montgomery protests. Patton explodes in anger. Eisenhower's decision is final, the safe approach wins. The war continues. September 10, 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters. Patton reads the supply allocation orders and calculates their impact. Third Army's daily fuel requirement to maintain offensive operations is approximately 400,000 gallons. The new allocation provides approximately 75,000 gallons daily, with even that reduced amount subject to further cuts when other armies require priority. Patton does the math. At this fuel rate, Third Army can maintain defensive positions but cannot conduct major offensives. Meanwhile, Montgomery's planned operation, codenamed Market Garden, is receiving priority supply. 3 Allied airborne divisions will drop behind German lines in Holland, seizing bridges over the Rhine and its tributaries. British ground forces will drive north along a single highway, relieving the airborne divisions and establishing a bridgehead across the Rhine. It's the largest airborne operation in history, designed to bypass German defensive lines and create the breakthrough Montgomery needs. The operation requires massive resources: transport aircraft, supplies, ammunition, fuel, all diverted from other operations, all unavailable to Third Army. Patton tells his staff, "Ike is giving Monty the credit for winning the war. We'll be stuck here while the British get the glory." His prophecy is partially accurate. But Market Garden is about to prove that glory and success are not synonymous. September 17, 1944, Holland. Operation Market Garden begins. At approximately 1300 hours, transport aircraft carrying the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and British 1st Airborne Division reach their drop zones in Holland. Paratroopers jump from C-47 transport planes. Gliders carrying artillery and vehicles land in fields behind German lines. It's an awesome display of air power and coordination, thousands of paratroopers dropping from clear skies, the largest airborne assault ever attempted. The plan requires the paratroopers to capture and hold 9 bridges across multiple rivers and canals, creating a corridor from the Belgian border to Arnhem on the Rhine. British ground forces, led by XXX Corps with armour and infantry, will drive north along this corridor, moving 64 miles in 2 to 3 days to relieve the airborne forces. If it works, the Allies will have a bridgehead across the Rhine, the last major geographical barrier before Germany's industrial heart. If it fails, thousands of elite paratroopers will be stranded behind German lines, surrounded, facing destruction. Montgomery has called the operation a bridge too far to Arnhem, acknowledging the risk but arguing the potential payoff justifies the gamble. The operation begins well. The first bridges are captured quickly, then German resistance stiffens, and the plan starts to unravel. September 19 through 25, 1944. The Market Garden Corridor. XXX Corps advances north along Highway 69, the single road connecting the Belgian border to Arnhem, fighting German forces that are surprisingly well organised and determined. The highway passes through flat polderland with no alternative routes, making it vulnerable to German counterattacks from both flanks. British armour advances slowly, 3 to 4 miles per day, instead of the 20-plus miles daily required by the plan. German forces, including elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions refitting near Arnhem, counterattack the airborne perimeters. The American divisions at Nijmegen and Eindhoven hold their objectives, fighting off German attacks, keeping their bridges open. But the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem is surrounded by far stronger German forces than intelligence predicted. The paratroopers, approximately 10,000 men, hold a small perimeter near the Arnhem Bridge for days, fighting house to house, casualties mounting, supplies running low. They wait for XXX Corps to arrive. XXX Corps is still 40 miles away, blocked by German resistance. Radio communications break down. Resupply airdrops fall into German-held territory. The British paratroopers are being destroyed while ground forces inch forward too slowly to save them. September 25, 1944. Operation Market Garden is called off. XXX Corps has advanced approximately 60 miles but failed to reach Arnhem, stopped by German resistance and terrain constraints. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem has been destroyed as a fighting force. Approximately 1,400 killed, 6,500 captured, only 2,000 escaping across the Rhine during a desperate nighttime evacuation. The 2 American airborne divisions at Nijmegen and Eindhoven held their objectives successfully but at heavy cost, approximately 3,500 American casualties. Total Allied casualties exceeds 17,000, killed, wounded, and captured. The operation gains 60 miles of Dutch territory but fails to cross the Rhine, fails to create the breakthrough Montgomery promised, fails to justify the resources diverted from other operations. It's the most expensive Allied failure of the Western European campaign. And while Market Garden unfolds, Third Army sits near Metz with empty gas tanks, reading reports, wondering what might have been achieved if those resources had gone to aggressive exploitation instead of failed airborne assault. October 15, 1944. Eisenhower's headquarters. Staff officers compile comparative statistics on Allied army performance, data that Eisenhower needs for planning future operations and supply allocations. The numbers tell a story that validates Patton's arguments and undermines Montgomery's. Third Army receiving approximately 1/3 the supply tonnage of British 21st Army Group and significantly less than American 1st Army, has inflicted approximately 2-to-1 casualty ratio on German forces, while advancing farther and faster than any other Allied army. Montgomery's armies, receiving priority supplies for Market Garden and other operations, have advanced more slowly, sustained heavier casualties relative to ground gained, and failed to achieve breakthrough despite favourable supply situation. The data suggests that aggressive leadership and mobile warfare produce better results than methodical preparation and overwhelming force, exactly what Patton has argued since 1920. But the data also arrives too late to influence the decisions that mattered. Market Garden has already consumed resources that could have fueled Third Army's advance. The opportunity to exploit German disorganisation in September has passed. German forces have stabilised their defence, brought up reserves, prepared positions. The war that might have ended in 1944 will continue through 1945. The strategic debate between Montgomery's concentrated thrust and Patton's parallel advance becomes one of World War II's enduring controversies. Montgomery argues that his plan would have worked if given sufficient resources and priority, that the Allies needed a concentrated knockout punch rather than distributed pressure, that half measures like Market Garden failed because they weren't supported adequately. Patton argues that his approach of relentless offensive pressure across multiple axes would have prevented German recovery, that distributing resources among aggressive commanders would have been more effective than concentrating them on a single operation. Eisenhower's broad front approach represented compromise between these extremes, refusing to accept the risk of either concentrated strategy. Post-war military historians debate endlessly which approach would have worked best, with no definitive consensus. But certain facts are clear. Market Garden failed despite receiving priority resources. Third Army succeeded spectacularly when given adequate fuel in August, then stalled when fuel was diverted elsewhere. Germany's western defence stabilised in September when Allied offensive momentum stopped due to logistics rather than German resistance. Whether different strategic choices would have ended the war in 1944 remains unprovable counterfactual. What's certain is that the war continued, that hundreds of thousands more people died in battles from autumn 1944 through spring 1945, and that Patton spent the rest of his life believing those deaths were unnecessary, that he could have prevented them, that institutional caution chose continued warfare over risky attempt at rapid victory. Patton's frustration during this period is palpable in his private writings. He sees the pattern repeating from his entire career: institutional resistance to aggressive action, preference for safe mediocrity over risky excellence, political considerations overruling military logic. He believes, probably correctly, that Third Army's August advance proved his theories about mechanized warfare were right. He believes, more questionably, that his army alone could have won the war in 1944 if given resources. He certainly believes, with considerable justification, that Allied command decisions in September squandered the opportunity created by Third Army's breakout. We had them beaten, he writes in October. We reached the German frontier while they were still disorganized and retreating. All we needed was gas. Instead, they gave the gas to Monty for an airborne operation that everyone except Monty knew would fail. Now we're stuck here fighting for Metz, bleeding men for every 100 yards, when we should be in Frankfurt preparing to cross the Rhine. They've extended the war by 6 months because they were afraid to take the risk that would end it. He's probably exaggerating. The logistical challenges of maintaining armies in Germany in autumn 1944 would have been severe, but he's also probably not completely wrong. The Allied victory was inevitable by September 1944. How long it would take and how many more people would die remained open questions. The answers to those questions were determined by strategic decisions made in September, and Patton never forgave the commanders who made those decisions. The warrior who spent his life preparing for decisive combat was learning that modern war is determined as much by logistics and politics as by fighting. He hated that lesson, but the lesson was true anyway. Ardennes Forest, Belgium and Luxembourg, December 16, 1944, 05:30 hours. The morning darkness explodes with German artillery fire. Approximately 1,600 guns opening simultaneously along an 80-mile front, the largest German artillery barrage on the Western Front since 1940. The bombardment lasts 90 minutes, shells falling on American positions held by the 1st Army's 8th Corps, 4 divisions spread thinly across the Ardennes sector. The sector has been quiet for months, considered a rest area for divisions battered in earlier fighting, defended by inexperienced units and exhausted veterans. Nobody expects major German offensive action here. The Germans attack with 3 armies, approximately 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks, complete surprise achieved through operational security and winter weather that grounds Allied reconnaissance aircraft. German infantry and armour smashed through American defensive positions, creating multiple penetrations, advancing 10 miles on the first day, 20 miles by December 17, 30 miles by December 18. American units collapse, retreat in confusion, lose communication with higher headquarters. The German breakthrough threatens to split the Allied front, capture major supply depots, potentially reach the Meuse River and beyond. It's the worst Allied crisis on the Western Front since Normandy. And Patton is 100 miles away at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, still besieging Metz, unaware that everything is about to change. December 18, 1944. Eisenhower calls emergency meeting at Shah F headquarters in Verdun, gathering his senior commanders to assess the German offensive and coordinate response. Bradley arrives worried. His 1st Army is taking the brunt of the German assault. Montgomery arrives confident. British forces are far from the breakthrough and he's already positioning reserves. Patton arrives ready to attack. Eisenhower explains the situation. German offensive has created a bulge in Allied lines, approximately 30 miles deep and 40 miles wide, threatening the critical road junction at Bastogne where 7 major highways converge. American forces at Bastogne, elements of the 8th Corps and the 101st Airborne Division hastily moved to the town, are surrounded by German forces. If Bastogne falls, Germans control the road network needed for further advance. If Bastogne holds, German advance stalls from logistical constraints. Eisenhower needs to rush reinforcements to Bastogne before Germans capture it. He looks at Patton. George, I want you to move 3rd Army north and hit the German flank. How soon can you attack? Patton already knows the answer because he's been wargaming this exact scenario for days, anticipating the German move, planning the response. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he says. The room goes silent. Staff officers think he's bluffing or insane. What Patton is proposing is logistically impossible. The impossible task: disengage 6 divisions from offensive operations around Metz, rotate them 90 degrees north, move them over 100 miles through winter weather on congested roads, coordinate with new adjacent units, establish new supply lines, conduct reconnaissance of unfamiliar terrain, plan and launch coordinated offensive operations, all in 48 hours. Military doctrine suggests this requires 4 to 5 days minimum, more likely a week. Divisions need time to break contact with the enemy, reorganize, move, prepare for new mission. Staffs need time to plan complex operations. Logistics need time to reposition supplies. Communication networks need time to be established. Patton is claiming he can do all this in 2 days. Bradley and Eisenhower look at him skeptically. "Don't be fatuous, George," Eisenhower says. Patton replies, "This time the Krauts have stuck their head in a meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." He pulls out a map, already marked with 3 different attack plans, depending on which direction Eisenhower wants Third Army to strike. He's been preparing for this moment since the German offensive began, anticipating exactly this conversation, ready to move before being asked. Eisenhower approves the operation. Third Army will attack north on December 22, striking the southern shoulder of the German penetration, driving toward Bastogne to relieve the surrounded garrison. Patton has 48 hours. The countdown begins. December 19 through 21, 1944. Third Army headquarters becomes controlled chaos as Patton's staff executes the pivot. Coded radio messages go to 6 divisions: 4th Armoured, 26th Infantry, 80th Infantry, 5th Infantry, 28th Infantry, 35th Infantry. Approximately 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, 62,000 tons of supplies must shift from east-facing offensive to north-facing attack. The staff works in shifts around the clock, coordinating movements, deconflicting road networks, positioning supplies. Engineers prepare roads and bridges for heavy traffic. Military police establish traffic control points. Liaison officers race to First Army to coordinate boundaries and communication. Intelligence officers compile information on German units and terrain. Artillery officers plan fire support for units they've never supported before. It's organised chaos. Hundreds of simultaneous tasks requiring coordination and execution under time pressure. And through it all, Patton drives his staff relentlessly, appearing at command posts, demanding faster movement, accepting no excuses. When commanders report difficulties, he relieves them and appoints replacements willing to attempt the impossible. When staff officers say tasks can't be completed on schedule, he tells them to complete the tasks anyway and worry about how later. Third Army transforms from siege operation to mobile assault in under 72 hours, a feat of operational agility that military professionals will study for decades. December 22, 1944. 0600 hours. Third Army attacks north through a blizzard, 3 divisions advancing on 3 axes toward Bastogne, 20 miles away. The weather is atrocious. Sub-freezing temperatures, snow and ice. Visibility measured in yards. The roads are treacherous, vehicles sliding, traffic jams forming at bottlenecks. German resistance is fierce. The divisions attacking north are hitting the southern flank of the German penetration, encountering Wehrmacht forces still full of offensive spirit, supported by armour and artillery. But Third Army maintains momentum, fighting through German positions, advancing 5 to 10 miles on December 22 despite weather and resistance. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units, approximately 18,000 men, are completely surrounded by 4 German divisions. They've been under siege since December 20, fighting off constant attacks, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. The German commander demands surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, temporary commander of the Bastogne garrison, responds with one word: nuts. The siege continues. The 101st holds. And Third Army fights north through German lines, racing to arrive before the garrison is overwhelmed. December 23 through 25, 1944. The weather clears. Allied aircraft can finally fly, providing close air support, interdicting German supply lines, attacking German armour concentrations. The clearing sky is partially coincidence, winter weather patterns shifting, but Patton credits divine intervention, specifically his weather prayer. In late December, Patton had his Third Army chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, write a prayer requesting clear weather for combat operations. Patton ordered 250,000 copies printed on small cards, distributed to every soldier in Third Army. The prayer reads, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers, who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations." The weather clears on December 23, 3 days after the prayers are distributed. Patton is genuinely convinced his prayer worked, that God intervened to provide tactical air support. His staff is less certain. But clear skies objectively helped Third Army's advance, allowing airstrikes on German positions, blocking the approach to Bastogne, December 26, 1944. 16:45 hours. Bastogne perimeter. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, leads his tanks through German positions southwest of Bastogne. His tank, named Cobra King, pushes through light German resistance, crosses the last ridge, and sees Bastogne ahead. Boggess's tanks enter the perimeter at 16:50 hours, linking up with the 101st Airborne's command post. The siege is broken. Third Army has advanced 20 miles in 4 days through German defensive lines, winter weather, and difficult terrain, achieving the relief everyone thought impossible. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers have held for 7 days against overwhelming German forces, sustained approximately 2,000 casualties, held the critical road junction that prevented German advance. The combined success, Third Army's relief, and the 101st's defense, stops German offensive momentum in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge will continue for weeks, but the crisis has passed. The German gamble has failed. And Patton has achieved what military professionals consider the single most impressive operational maneuver of World War II. 90-degree pivot of an entire army in 48 hours, followed by successful offensive through enemy territory under winter conditions. December 27, 1944. Patton visits Bastogne, touring the destroyed town, meeting with McAuliffe and the 101st Airborne, inspecting the defensive positions that held against 4 German divisions. He thanks the paratroopers for their stand, tells them they've proven that American soldiers can match German troops in defensive determination. Then he returns to Third Army headquarters and issues orders for continued offensive operations. The relief of Bastogne isn't the end of Third Army's mission. It's the beginning. German forces still occupy the Bulge in Allied lines, still threaten Allied positions, still need to be defeated and driven back. Third Army will continue attacking north and east, shrinking the Bulge, killing Germans, reclaiming territory. Patton has no intention of settling for successful defense. We're not just going to shoot the bastards, he tells his staff. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. It's typical Patton rhetoric, profane and violent, designed to project aggression and maintain offensive spirit. It's also an accurate description of what Third Army will do for the next month, grinding forward through winter combat, eliminating the Bulge, pushing German forces back to their starting positions. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last major attack in the West. From December 1944 forward, Germany is purely defensive, trying to delay inevitable defeat. And Patton's Third Army is one of the primary instruments of that defeat. The Bastogne operation becomes Patton's signature achievement, the operational feat that validates his entire career and doctrine. Military historians study it as perhaps the finest example of operational agility in modern warfare, demonstrating what well-trained forces under aggressive leadership can achieve. The speed of the pivot is studied at staff colleges worldwide. The ability to maintain offensive momentum despite difficult conditions becomes a benchmark for military excellence. But the operation also reveals Patton's limitations and the genuine costs of his methods. Third Army sustained approximately 1,400 casualties during the 4-day advance to Bastogne, acceptable losses given the operational success, but still representing families destroyed, soldiers killed and maimed. Patton's aggressive timeline pushed units beyond normal limits, accepting casualties that more cautious commanders might have avoided through slower, more methodical advance. The question that haunts military ethics: were those casualties necessary to save Bastogne, or could the relief have been achieved with fewer deaths through different methods? Patton would answer that speed saves lives overall, that faster relief meant fewer casualties for the Bastogne garrison, that aggressive action shortens wars and reduces total suffering. His critics answer that Patton's methods unnecessarily risked his own soldiers' lives for operational glory, that more careful planning might have achieved the same results with fewer casualties. Both arguments have merit. Neither is definitively provable. But Bastogne remains Patton's finest hour, the moment when everything he believed about warfare proved correct, when his theories validated themselves in combat, when institutional skepticism about his methods was overcome by undeniable success. For once, Patton's aggressive instincts and the military situation perfectly aligned. The result was tactical brilliance. The cost was measured in American lives. and Patton considered the cost acceptable because victory matters more than anything else. That calculation defines both his genius and his moral blindness. Echternach, Luxembourg, January 29, 1945. Third Army launches its assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications, a system of concrete bunkers, tank obstacles, and minefields stretching along the entire German frontier. The Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by Germans, was built in the 1930s as Germany's answer to France's Maginot Line. Hundreds of miles of fortifications designed to make invasion of Germany prohibitively expensive. American forces have been probing the line since September, testing its defences, learning its weaknesses. Now, in the dead of winter, with snow covering the ground and temperatures below freezing, Patton orders the assault. His staff questions the timing. Why attack in winter when spring would offer better weather? Patton's answer is characteristically aggressive. The Germans expect us to wait for spring. We attack when they don't expect it. Surprise is worth more than good weather. Third Army smashes into the Siegfried Line with 4 divisions, using tactics developed through months of hard fighting, combined arms coordination, close air support, artillery concentration, engineer support for obstacle breaching. The bunkers are formidable, but they're undermanned and undersupplied, garrisoned by second-rate troops and old men. Within 72 hours, Third Army has penetrated the Siegfried Line at multiple points. Germany's frontier defences, the fortifications that were supposed to make invasion impossible, have been breached. The penetration of the Siegfried Line represents psychological victory as much as tactical success. Germany has spent 5 years telling its population that the West Wall makes the Reich impregnable, that Allied armies will break themselves against its defences, that German soil is protected by concrete and steel. Third Army's rapid breakthrough destroys that myth, announces that Allied forces are entering Germany itself, makes concrete what has been increasingly obvious since D-Day: Germany has lost the war. But German resistance doesn't collapse. Instead, it intensifies. German soldiers defending their homeland fight with desperation born of fear. Fear of occupation, fear of retribution for Nazi crimes, fear of the Soviet advance from the east. American forces encounter German units that refuse to surrender even when surrounded, that counterattack even when outnumbered, that fight for every town and city with fanatical determination. The combat in Germany is more vicious, more costly, more bitter than fighting in France. Patton expected the Germans to crack once Allied forces crossed the frontier. Instead, they're fighting harder than ever. The race to end the war is turning into a grinding campaign of attrition. March 22, 1944. 2200 hours. Oppenheim on the Rhine River. Under cover of darkness, the 5th Infantry Division begins crossing the Rhine in assault boats, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Germany's last major geographical barrier breached with minimal casualties. Patton has been planning this crossing for weeks, identifying Oppenheim as an ideal crossing site. Lightly defended, suitable terrain on both banks within Third Army's sector. He deliberately chose a crossing location and timing that would allow Third Army to beat Montgomery across the Rhine. Montgomery has been preparing Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece crossing of the Rhine near Wesel, scheduled for March 23, with elaborate planning, overwhelming force, and maximum publicity. Patton crosses 24 hours earlier with minimal preparation and achieves complete surprise. By the time Montgomery's operation begins, with its artillery barrage and airborne assault, Third Army already has a solid bridgehead across the Rhine. Patton calls Bradley to report the crossing. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across the Rhine." Bradley asks about casualties. Patton replies, 34 men killed and wounded. That's all. Bradley is stunned. Montgomery's crossing will involve over 1 million artillery shells and cost over 4,000 casualties. Patton crossed with 34 casualties by moving fast and striking where the enemy was weak. March 23, 1945. Afternoon. Patton visits the Rhine Bridge his engineers have constructed at Oppenheim, a pontoon bridge capable of carrying heavy armour. He walks to the middle of the bridge, stops, looks down at the river flowing beneath him, and deliberately urinates into the Rhine. It's pure Patton theatre, symbolic desecration of Germany's greatest defensive barrier, crude gesture designed to demonstrate contempt for German military power, performance calculated to demoralise the enemy and inspire his own troops. Photographers capture the moment. Patton later tells Bradley, "I've been looking forward to this for a long time. The gesture is juvenile, vulgar, and militarily meaningless. It's also psychologically effective, the kind of symbolic action that becomes legend, that soldiers repeat in bars for decades afterward, that cements Patton's reputation as a commander who leads from the front and shares his soldiers' contempt for the enemy." Military professionals can debate whether crossing the Rhine 24 hours before Montgomery matters strategically. But every soldier in Third Army knows that their commander pissed in the Rhine while Montgomery was still preparing to cross. In the psychology of combat, that matters. The Rhine crossing opens Germany to Allied exploitation. Third Army drives east and south, racing across Germany at speeds approaching the August advance through France, covering 270 miles in 15 days. The Wehrmacht is collapsing, not from lack of fighting spirit, but from overwhelming material disadvantage. Insufficient fuel, ammunition, replacement troops, and equipment to stop Allied armies advancing on multiple axes. German units fight skillful defensive actions, slow Allied advances, inflict casualties, but cannot stop the Allied tide. Third Army reaches the Czech frontier by early April, having cut through central Germany, liberated hundreds of towns and cities, captured tens of thousands of prisoners. The end is visible now. Germany's defeat imminent. The question no longer whether Germany will lose, but when and how. And then Third Army encounters something that changes the war's meaning, that transforms Patton's understanding of what they've been fighting for. They discover the concentration camps. April 4, 1945, Ohrdruf. Third Army's 4th Armoured Division approaches a small camp near the town of Ohrdruf, part of the Buchenwald concentration camp system, a forced labour site where prisoners were worked to death. Soldiers enter the camp expecting a prisoner of war facility. What they find is hell on earth. Thousands of corpses stacked in open pits, emaciated survivors too weak to stand, torture chambers, crematoria still containing partially burned bodies. The smell is overwhelming, a stench of death and decay that soldiers will remember for the rest of their lives. Medics try to help the survivors and realise many are beyond medical assistance, starved so severely their bodies are consuming themselves. Soldiers vomit. Hardened combat veterans who survived months of combat break down crying. Officers report up the chain of command, struggling to find words to describe what they've found. Patton arrives to inspect personally, walking through the camp, viewing the horror, and vomits outside one of the barracks. He orders every soldier in the surrounding units to tour the camp, to see what they're fighting against, to understand that this war is about more than territory and politics. Patton's reaction to the concentration camps reveals something unexpected, moral clarity that transcends his usual warrior philosophy. He has spent his career focused on tactical and operational excellence, viewing war as contest between armies, judging success by territory captured and enemies killed. The camps force him to confront evil that exists beyond military competition, atrocities that have nothing to do with battlefield honour or warrior codes. His diary entry from April 4 reads, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." He orders the civilian population of Ohrdruf to tour the camp and bury the dead, forcing German civilians to confront what was done in their name. When the Burgermeister of Ohrdruf and his wife see the camp, they return home and commit suicide. Patton feels no sympathy. The German people claim they didn't know. He tells his staff, now they know, and they'll have to live with what they allowed to happen. April 11, 1945, Buchenwald. Eisenhower, Bradley and Patton tour the main Buchenwald camp together, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, where approximately 56,000 people died during the camp's operation. The three American generals walked through barracks, where prisoners were starved, past medical experimentation facilities, through warehouses containing possessions stolen from murdered victims. Thousands of pairs of shoes, piles of eyeglasses, rooms full of human hair. They view the cremation ovens where bodies were burned, the execution chambers where prisoners were hanged or shot. Eisenhower later writes, "I have never felt able to describe my emotional reaction when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency." He orders extensive documentation, photographs, films, witness testimony, physical evidence. He orders German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camp and bury the dead. He ensures that the camps are preserved as evidence for future trials and for history. Bradley is shaken but controlled. Patton is visibly affected, his usual aggressive confidence replaced by something closer to horror. Third Army liberates multiple camps in April. Ohrdruf on April 4, Buchenwald on April 11, Flossenburg on April 23, Dachau on April 29. Each camp reveals new horrors. Gas chambers at some facilities, medical experiments, systematic starvation, torture, murder on industrial scale. Third Army soldiers free approximately 85,000 prisoners from these camps, survivors of a system designed to work them to death or kill them outright. Many prisoners are so weak they die after liberation despite medical care. The soldiers who liberate the camps are permanently marked by what they witness. Combat veterans who survived Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge say the camps are worse than any battlefield, that seeing industrial murder is more traumatic than experiencing combat. Patton ensures that every unit that liberates a camp documents what they find, photographs, everything, preserves evidence. He understands that people will deny this happened, that future generations might not believe the testimony, that physical evidence and documentation are essential. The warrior who spent his career focused on tactical excellence now becomes an advocate for preserving evidence of genocide. The concentration camps transform Patton's understanding of World War II. Before the camps, he viewed the war as military contests between nations, Germany versus the Allies, armies fighting for national interests. The camps reveal that the war is moral as well as military, that the Nazi regime represents evil that transcends normal warfare, that defeating Germany means stopping genocide as well as conquering territory. This realization doesn't make Patton more humane or less aggressive. If anything, it makes him more ruthless, more willing to kill German soldiers, more contemptuous of German civilians who claim ignorance. But it does give him moral certainty that was absent before. Every time someone questions whether the war's cost is justified, Patton can point to the camps. Every time someone suggests negotiating with Germany rather than demanding unconditional surrender, he can describe what he saw at Buchenwald. The camps become proof that the war is absolutely necessary, that no compromise with Nazi Germany was possible, that every American death was justified by preventing genocide from continuing. It's the only time in Patton's career when his military objectives and his moral convictions perfectly align. He's not just defeating an enemy army, he's stopping evil. And for once, the warrior who lives for combat is fighting for something larger than victory. By late April, Third Army has penetrated deep into Germany and Czechoslovakia, approaching Prague from the west, positioned to liberate the Czech capital before Soviet forces arrive from the east. Czech resistance fighters in Prague rise up against German occupation on May 5th, fighting in the streets, begging for American assistance. Patton asks Eisenhower for permission to drive into Prague, to support the uprising, to liberate the city. Eisenhower refuses. The Yalta Conference agreements divided Europe into spheres of influence, giving Czechoslovakia to the Soviet zone. Eisenhower won't violate those agreements, won't risk conflict with the Soviets over Prague, orders Third Army to halt at Pilsen and wait for Soviet forces to reach Prague from the east. Patton is furious. "We could take Prague in 2 days," he tells Bradley. "The Czechs want us there. Instead, we're going to let the Russians take it, and the Czechs will spend the next 50 years under Soviet occupation." He's prophetic. Soviet forces enter Prague on May 9. Czechoslovakia becomes a Soviet satellite state until 1989. But Patton's prophecy doesn't matter. The decision has been made at levels above his authority. The warrior who spent months racing toward Germany is ordered to stop short of one of Europe's great capitals for political reasons he considers cowardly and short-sighted. The pattern from his entire career repeats one final time. Military success, limited by political considerations, aggressive commander restrained by cautious superiors, the warrior stopped when he wants to keep fighting. This time, the restraint comes not from logistics or supply issues, but from grand strategy and alliance politics. It doesn't matter. Patton is still stopped, still frustrated, still convinced that the people making decisions don't understand warfare the way he does. And this time, he might actually be right about the long-term consequences. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, May 8, 1945. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The German High Command has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is officially over. Third Army sits at Pilsen, 30 miles from Prague, watching Soviet forces occupy the Czech capital that Patton was forbidden to liberate. Czech civilians approach American positions begging for help, pleading with Third Army to continue into Prague, explaining that German forces are still fighting Soviet troops in the city. Patton's soldiers want to go. Patton wants to give the order. But Eisenhower's instructions are absolute. Do not advance beyond current positions, maintain boundaries with Soviet forces, avoid any action that could create conflict with America's Soviet allies. Patton obeys the order. He has no choice. But his diary entry from May 8 reveals his thinking. I could have taken Prague. I should have taken Prague. We sat here and let the Russians take it, and someday we're going to regret it. We are going to have to fight them eventually anyway. We should have done it while we were already here and ready. It's one of Patton's most famous statements, predicting the Cold War 3 years before it officially begins, advocating for immediate conflict with the Soviet Union while America has military superiority. In May 1945, this position seems insane. By 1948, it will look prophetic. Patton's anti-Soviet statements become more frequent and more public as he transitions from combat commander to occupation governor. Third Army occupies Bavaria, including Munich and much of southern Germany, responsible for military government of approximately 4 million German civilians. The mission requires completely different skills than combat operations: civil administration, denazification, political reconstruction, cooperation with Soviet forces occupying adjacent zones. These are exactly the skills Patton lacks. He's a warrior, not an administrator. He understands destroying enemy armies, not governing occupied populations. He believes in discipline and force, not political nuance and diplomatic cooperation. The job requires patience, tact, and willingness to work with Soviet officials. Patton has none of these qualities. Instead, he has growing conviction that the Soviet Union represents the next enemy, that World War II solved one totalitarian threat only to empower another, that America should fight the Soviets now rather than later. He starts saying this publicly, in press conferences and social gatherings, statements that create diplomatic crises and infuriate Eisenhower. August 1945, Bavaria. Patton implements denazification policies as required by Allied occupation directives, but does so reluctantly and with public complaints that undermine the program's credibility. The denazification program requires removal of all Nazi Party members from positions of authority: government officials, teachers, police, utility managers, engineers, anyone who held Nazi Party membership. The goal is to eliminate Nazi influence from German society and punish those who supported the regime. The problem is that Nazi Party membership was essentially mandatory for many professional positions during the Third Reich, that eliminating everyone who held party membership creates administrative chaos, that running utilities and basic services requires technical expertise that exists primarily among former party members. Patton argues, with some validity, that low-level Nazi Party members who were engineers or clerks should be retained to keep basic services functioning, that distinguishing between ideological Nazis and opportunistic party members is necessary for practical governance. But he makes these arguments publicly and crudely, comparing Nazi Party membership to Democratic or Republican Party membership in America, suggesting that most party members were harmless bureaucrats who shouldn't be punished. September 22, 1945, press conference. Patton fields questions from war correspondents about denazification policy. One reporter asks if Patton differentiates between Nazis and non-Nazis in his occupation zone. Patton's response creates instant controversy. The Nazi thing is just like a Democrat-Republican fight. To get things done in Bavaria, after the complete disruption of 4 years of war, we had to compromise with the devil a little. We had no alternative but to turn to the people who knew what to do and how to do it. A lot of these people were in the Nazi Party. He continues, making things worse. Military government was supposed to start out with a lot of school teachers. Well, they couldn't run a railroad or do anything else. So whether or not they were Nazis is beside the point. The correspondents recognize immediately that Patton has just publicly dismissed the moral distinction between Nazis and non-Nazis, suggested that Nazi Party membership is morally equivalent to American political party membership, argued that efficiency matters more than denazification. The story reaches American newspapers within days. Congressional representatives demand his removal. Jewish organizations file protests. The State Department expresses concern about international reaction. September 28, 1945. Eisenhower's headquarters, Frankfurt. Private meeting between Eisenhower and Patton, one of the most painful conversations of both men's careers. Eisenhower explains that the press conference comments are indefensible, that Patton's continued public statements about Soviet threat and Nazi Party members have created political crisis that threatens occupation policy credibility. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Undersecretary Robert Patterson both want Patton relieved immediately. Congressional pressure is mounting. Eisenhower has protected Patton through the slapping incidents, the Knutsford speech, numerous other controversies. He cannot protect him anymore. Patton is being relieved of 3rd Army Command, effective immediately. He'll be reassigned to 15th Army Headquarters, a paper organisation tasked with writing the official history of European operations, essentially forced retirement disguised as final assignment. Patton leaves the meeting in tears, the first time his staff has ever seen him cry. He's 60 years old, the most successful American ground commander of the war, and he's being dismissed for political statements and administrative failures. The warrior who won every battle has lost the peace. The relief of Patton from 3rd Army Command represents tragic failure of a brilliant combat commander to adapt to non-combat requirements. Everything that made Patton effective in battle, his aggressive confidence, his contempt for caution, his focus on action over deliberation, made him disastrous at occupation governance. Military government requires political sensitivity, careful navigation of complex social issues, cooperation with civilian authorities and allied powers. Patton had spent 4 decades learning to destroy enemy armies. He spent 0 time learning to govern civilian populations. The army promoted him based on combat performance and then assigned him missions requiring completely different skills. It's organisational failure as much as individual failure. The institution that values combat effectiveness above all else created commanders who excel at fighting but fail at everything else. Patton is the extreme example of this pattern, a man so specialised for offensive combat that he cannot function in any other context. The relief is painful but probably necessary. 3rd Army deserves a commander who can manage occupation duties competently. Bavaria's civilian population deserves a governor who doesn't publicly minimise Nazi crimes. But the relief also represents terrible waste. America's most aggressive combat commander sidelined just as tensions with the Soviet Union begin, the officer who predicted the Cold War removed from command for predicting the Cold War too loudly and too early. Patton's final months in Germany are bitter and sad, a warrior without a war, a combat commander relegated to writing reports. 15th Army Headquarters is located in Bad Nauheim, a pleasant German town that becomes Patton's final posting. The mission is to compile the official history of 3rd Army and European operations, interviewing participants, reviewing records, preparing narrative accounts. It's important work, ensuring accurate historical documentation. It's also not combat command. Patton goes through the motions, supervising the historical research, but his heart isn't in it. He writes letters to Beatrice discussing return to America, retirement to their California ranch, civilian life after 40 years in uniform. He talks about writing his memoirs, consulting for defense contractors, staying connected to military affairs. But the letters are sad. The writing of a man who knows his useful career is over, that he'll never command soldiers in combat again, that the destiny he felt so certain about as a child has been fulfilled and is now finished. He's achieved everything he believed he was born to do. He liberated France, conquered half of Germany, saved Bastogne, crossed the Rhine. He proved his theories about mechanized warfare correct. He earned his place in military history, and none of it feels satisfying because it's over and he's still alive and he doesn't know how to exist without war. The tragedy of Patton's final months is that he was right about the Soviets and wrong about how to address the threat. His prediction that America would eventually fight the Soviet Union was accurate. The Cold War began within 3 years of Germany's surrender, exactly the confrontation Patton warned about. His prediction that retaining capable administrators mattered more than punishing every party member had merit. Effective governance of occupied Germany required practical compromise with the devil, exactly what Patton said. But his crude public statements and inability to articulate these positions diplomatically destroyed his credibility and made his arguments politically toxic. If Patton had possessed political skill to match his tactical genius, if he'd learned to communicate his concerns through proper channels rather than press conferences, he might have influenced American policy toward the Soviets and shaped occupation policy effectively. Instead, His lack of political sophistication turned every valid insight into controversy, every accurate prediction into crisis. The warrior who mastered tactical warfare never learned strategic politics. And the institutional army, which valued his tactical skills enough to tolerate his political disasters during wartime, decided those political disasters weren't worth tolerating during peacetime. The relief from Third Army Command is presented as routine rotation. Everyone knows it's forced retirement. Patton knows. His staff knows. The press knows. Only the official paperwork pretends otherwise. November 1945. Patton prepares to return to America for vacation and consultation about his future role. He's considering retirement, thinking about writing, contemplating civilian life. But he's also angling for future command position, hoping someone in Washington will find use for a general who understands the Soviet threat, believing that his predictions about future conflict will eventually vindicate him and lead to recall to active command. He's 60 years old, too old for combat command by peacetime standards, but convinced he still has contributions to make. He plans to spend December in Germany, finishing 15th Army responsibilities, then return to America in late December or early January. He never considers that he won't survive December. The warrior who survived 4 years of frontline combat in 2 world wars, who walked through machine gun fire at Meuse-Argonne and Gela, who commanded armies across North Africa and Europe, doesn't imagine dying in peacetime Germany from a traffic accident. Fate has one final cruelty waiting for George Patton. The man who believed he was destined for greatness, who achieved that greatness in combat, is about to discover that destiny doesn't guarantee survival. Sometimes the hero dies after the war ends, killed not by enemy action but by random chance, dying meaninglessly when meaningful death would have been so much more appropriate. Patton's death will be absolutely stupid, utterly random, completely meaningless. And maybe that's the point. Warriors don't get to choose their deaths. They just get to fight until death finds them. Mannheim, Germany, December 9, 1945, 11:45 a.m. General George S. Patton sits in the back seat of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 sedan, his 4-star flag flying from the front fender, driven by his longtime driver, Private First Class Horace Woodring. Next to him sits Major General Hobart Gay, 3rd Army Chief of Staff and Patton's close friend. They're driving from Bad Nauheim toward Mannheim for a day of hunting pheasant, a recreational trip on a Sunday morning, peaceful activity in occupied Germany. The road is straight, visibility is good despite winter weather, traffic is light. A United States Army 2.5-ton truck carrying soldiers approaches from the opposite direction, preparing to make a left turn. The truck driver, Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson, begins his turn, crossing into the Cadillac's lane. Woodring sees the truck turning but cannot stop in time. He swerves. The Cadillac strikes the truck at approximately 15 to 20 miles per hour, a low-speed collision that barely damages either vehicle. Woodring and Gay are uninjured. But Patton, sitting in the back seat, is thrown forward violently, his head striking the roof or an interior partition. He collapses back into the seat, unable to move, conscious but paralyzed from the neck down. "I think I'm paralyzed," he says calmly. "Work my fingers for me." Gay tries to move Patton's fingers. They don't respond. Within minutes, American military police arrive at the accident scene. Medics assess Patton's condition. Conscious, alert, but unable to move any part of his body below his neck. They recognize severe spinal injury, possibly broken vertebrae, potentially fatal. They immobilize Patton carefully and transport him to 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, the nearest facility with neurosurgical capability. The drive takes approximately 45 minutes, Patton conscious throughout, making dark jokes about his condition, apologizing to his driver for the accident, asking repeatedly about his ability to walk again. The medics don't answer. They know the prognosis is bad but don't want to tell him until proper medical examination confirms the extent of injury. At the hospital, neurosurgeon Colonel Lawrence Ball examines Patton and orders x-rays. The films show what Ball feared: cervical spine fracture at the C3 and C4 vertebrae, complete spinal cord compression. Medical knowledge in 1945 cannot repair this injury. Patton will never walk. Again. He'll never move his arms or hands. He'll remain paralyzed for whatever time he has left. Ball tells Patton the truth. The injury is permanent. Modern medicine in 1945 cannot fix spinal cord damage. Patton will be paralyzed for the rest of his life. The best outcome they can hope for is to keep him alive and comfortable, prevent complications like pneumonia and bed sores, eventually transfer him to America for long-term care. Patton receives the news calmly, asking clinical questions about his prognosis, his care options, his probable lifespan. Ball explains that paralysis from this level of spinal injury is usually fatal within weeks or months from complications, pneumonia, blood clots, infections, heart failure. Patton nods, understanding. He asks about his chances of recovery, whether experimental treatments exist, whether he might regain any movement. Ball says no. Medical science in 1945 cannot help him. 60 years later, this injury might be survivable with modern spinal surgery, stabilization techniques, and rehabilitation. But in December 1945, it's a death sentence. Patton asks how long he has. Ball estimates weeks to months, depending on complications. Patton says, "So this is it. This is how it ends." He doesn't sound surprised. He sounds almost resigned, like he's been expecting death for years, and is only surprised by the manner, not the fact. Beatrice arrives from America on December 14, flying by military transport to be with her husband. She finds Patton in a hospital bed, conscious but unable to move, tubes and medical equipment surrounding him. They talk for hours, reminiscing about their life together, their children, the California ranch where they plan to retire. Patton apologizes for the accident as if he could have prevented a random truck collision. Beatrice tells him to stop apologizing, that they've had a remarkable life together, that she's proud of everything he accomplished. They discuss whether to move him to America for treatment. The doctors recommend against it. The trip might kill him. Moving a patient with this severe spinal injury risks fatal complications. Better to keep him comfortable in Heidelberg until his condition stabilizes, if it stabilizes. Patton agrees. He doesn't want to die during medical transport. If he's going to die, he wants to do it with dignity, not thrashing around in an aircraft medical evacuation. So he stays in Heidelberg, and everyone waits to see if he'll survive or succumb to the complications that kill most spinal injury patients. December 20, 1945, 5:30 p.m. Patton's condition deteriorates throughout the day. He develops severe difficulty breathing, a sign that paralysis is affecting his respiratory muscles. His blood pressure becomes unstable. Medical staff increase monitoring, prepare for possible cardiac or respiratory arrest. Beatrice sits by his bedside, holding his hand even though he cannot feel it. Patton drifts in and out of consciousness, occasionally making comments about the ranch in California, about horses they owned, about their early years together. At 5:40 p.m., he becomes more alert, looking at Beatrice directly. They talk quietly about their planned retirement, the life they won't have together. Patton says, "I suppose this is it." Beatrice tells him to rest, that he needs to conserve energy. At 5:50 p.m., Patton suffers cardiac arrest, probably from pulmonary embolism. A blood clot that formed in his paralyzed legs travelled to his lungs, blocked blood flow to his heart. Medical staff attempt resuscitation but cannot save him. General George Smith Patton Jr. dies at 5:55 p.m. on December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the traffic accident, 60 years old, mourned by millions, hated by thousands, remembered by everyone who knew him as the most aggressive American combat commander of World War II. The randomness of Patton's death is almost insulting to his memory. He survived 2 world wars, survived walking through machine gun fire, survived commanding armies from the front lines, survived battles that killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and he dies in a minor traffic accident at low speed on a quiet road in occupied Germany. There's no heroism in this death, no glory, no military meaning. It's just stupid bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, random truck driver making a turn. Conspiracy theories develop immediately. Soviet assassination, German revenge attack, Eisenhower's hit squad. Military investigators examine all these theories and find zero evidence supporting any of them. It was an accident, just an accident. The warrior who believed he was destined for greatness died meaninglessly, randomly, stupidly. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the universe has a sense of irony. Maybe destiny only carries you so far and then abandons you to chance. Or maybe it's just further proof that warfare is fundamentally random, that survival depends on luck as much as skill, that even the greatest commanders are just humans vulnerable to physics and chance. Patton commanded armies that killed thousands. Patton survived battles that killed hundreds around him, and Patton died because a truck turned left and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. There's no meaning in that. There's no lesson. It's just what happened. December 24, 1945, Luxembourg American Cemetery. Patton is buried with military honours among the soldiers of Third Army who died under his command, grave marker identical to those of enlisted men except for the 4 stars indicating his rank. Plot: I, row 10, grave 363. Beatrice insisted on burial in Luxembourg rather than the family plot in California, honouring Patton's expressed wish to be buried with his soldiers. Thousands attend the funeral. American officers, enlisted men, European dignitaries, war correspondents. The soldiers who served under Patton have complex feelings about his death. Some loved him, inspired by his aggressive leadership and visible courage. Some hated him, traumatized by his demands and his callousness toward casualties. Most feel both emotions simultaneously, recognizing that Patton was brilliant and flawed, effective and destructive, the best combat commander they ever served under, and also the cruelest. The funeral is somber, appropriate, respectful. Patton is honored as a war hero, his controversies temporarily forgotten, his accomplishments celebrated. The grave is simple, white cross like every other grave, name and rank, nothing elaborate. It's probably how Patton would have wanted it, buried among soldiers, equal in death if not in life, finally at rest after 60 years of relentless ambition. The immediate obituaries struggle to assess Patton's legacy. Military analysts praise his tactical brilliance, his operational innovation, his aggressive leadership that shortened the war. Political commentators criticize his diplomatic disasters, his administrative failures, his public statements that created endless controversy. Soldiers who served under him tell contradictory stories. Inspiring commander who led from the front, cruel taskmaster who treated men as expendable, brilliant tactician who won every engagement, reckless gambler who accepted unnecessary casualties. All these assessments are partially true. Patton was all of these things simultaneously. Genius and fool. Hero and villain. Brilliant innovator and dangerous extremist. The obituaries can't reconcile these contradictions because the contradictions can't be reconciled. Patton was paradox personified. A man whose greatest strengths were inseparable from his worst flaws, whose tactical genius required exactly the aggressive extremism that made him politically toxic, whose combat effectiveness demanded exactly the callousness that made him morally questionable. You cannot have Patton the great combat commander without also having Patton the political disaster. They're the same person. The question isn't whether to celebrate or condemn him. The question is whether his contributions outweighed his costs. And different people will answer that question differently for the rest of history. Nuremberg, Germany, 1946. The war crimes trials. German military officers testify about Allied commanders asked to assess who they feared most, who they considered most effective, whose operations caused greatest disruption to Wehrmacht planning. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West during much of 1944 and 45, is asked directly, "Who was the best Allied general you faced?" Rundstedt answers without hesitation, "Patton." The prosecutor asks why. Rundstedt explains, "Patton was the most dangerous because he thought like a German panzer commander. He understood speed and surprise. He was unpredictable. When facing Montgomery, we always knew what he would do. Methodical preparation, overwhelming force, predictable tactics. When facing Bradley, we knew he would be cautious and coordinated. But Patton could appear anywhere, attack from any direction, move faster than we thought possible. He was the closest thing to Guderian that the Americans produced. It's an extraordinary tribute from an enemy commander. Validation of everything Patton believed about mechanized warfare. Proof that his tactical methods were effective enough to earn respect from the army that invented Blitzkrieg. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, 1951. The Command and General Staff College, where American officers study military history and operational art. Third Army's operations in 1944 and 45 have become required study, particularly the August breakout from Normandy and the December relief of Bastogne. Instructors analyse Patton's methods. Emphasis on speed and momentum, willingness to accept risk, focus on destroying enemy forces rather than capturing terrain, aggressive exploitation of success, personal leadership from forward positions. Students study Third Army statistics, 1,200 miles advanced in 9 months of combat, 81,000 square miles liberated or captured, 1,280,000 prisoners taken, 144,500 enemy killed or wounded, 137,000 Third Army casualties. The casualty ratio appears favourable, approximately 1-to-1 exchange for killed and wounded, but nearly 10-to-1 for prisoners captured, suggesting that Third Army's mobility prevented Germans from organising effective defence, captured entire units before they could fight. The statistics support Patton's doctrine. Speed reduces casualties by disorganising enemy defence. Aggressive pursuit destroys armies more efficiently than methodical advance. Modern officers studying these operations recognise that Patton succeeded through operational art that emphasised tempo and psychological shock as much as firepower and numbers. The Pentagon, 1970. Military analysts compile comprehensive comparison of World War II commanders, attempting to identify which leadership methods correlated with success. They examine Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, and other army commanders, comparing resources allocated to each against results achieved. The analysis reveals patterns that vindicate Patton's approach while raising uncomfortable questions about Allied command decisions. Third Army received significantly less supply tonnage per division than Montgomery's 21st Army Group throughout 1944 and 45. Yet Third Army advanced farther, faster, and captured more enemy soldiers per ton of supplies received. The casualty ratio per mile advance favoured Third Army over most comparable formations, suggesting that aggressive operations actually reduced friendly casualties by preventing enemies from organising effective resistance. The analysis concludes that Patton achieved superior operational results with inferior resources through emphasis on tempo and aggression. But the analysis also reveals the political constraints. Concentration of resources on Patton's army would have violated coalition politics with Britain, created diplomatic friction with Montgomery, possibly damaged Allied unity. Military efficiency competed with political necessity. Politics won. The war lasted longer than military analysis suggests was necessary, but Allied coalition remained intact. Different people assess whether that trade-off was worthwhile. Fort Knox, Kentucky, 1980. The Armour School, where American tank officers received training. Patton's operations are studied as foundational texts of armoured warfare doctrine. Instructors teach Third Army's methods: combined arms integration, close air support procedures, mobile logistics, rapid tempo operations, aggressive exploitation of breakthrough. Modern armour doctrine, formalised as airland battle in the 1980s, explicitly incorporates principles Patton advocated in the 1920s and demonstrated in the 1940s: speed, surprise, depth, synchronization. The Armour School's museum includes exhibits on Patton's career, his contributions to armoured warfare development, his World War II operations. Young officers tour the museum, study his tactics, read his writings. Some admire him uncritically, seeing only the tactical genius. Others recognise the moral complexities, the slapping incidents, and cruel leadership that accompanied tactical brilliance. The instructors emphasise both aspects. Learn from Patton's operational art, but understand that his personal leadership methods violated modern army values, that contemporary commanders cannot replicate his abusive behaviours regardless of tactical effectiveness. Patton's genius is studied, his cruelty is condemned, both are remembered. Moscow, late 1980s. Soviet military archives begin opening after Glasnost, revealing secret assessments compiled during World War II. KGB files contain extensive documentation on Allied commanders, intelligence collection efforts, threat assessments. The files on Patton are substantial. Surveillance reports, analysis of his public statements, psychological profiles, assassination planning. The documents reveal that Stalin considered Patton a significant threat, not just militarily, but politically, that Patton's anti-Soviet statements and advocacy for immediate post-war conflict were taken seriously by Soviet leadership. One file contains minutes from a State Defense Committee meeting in September 1945, discussing whether to assassinate Patton before he returned to America and potentially influenced American policy toward greater confrontation with Soviet Union. The discussion concludes that assassination is too risky, potentially counterproductive, might make Patton a martyr, whose views gain credibility. Instead, they'll wait and hope his own statements destroy his credibility without Soviet intervention. When Patton dies in the traffic accident 3 months later, some Soviet officials suspect American military intelligence killed him to prevent diplomatic complications. KGB investigation finds no evidence of American involvement, concludes the accident was genuine, notes with satisfaction that problem solved itself without Soviet action required. These files, released decades after Patton's death, reveal how seriously both allies and enemies took him. The Germans feared his tactical unpredictability. The Soviets feared his political advocacy for confrontation. The Americans feared his inability to follow political guidance. All three assessments were accurate. Patton was militarily brilliant and politically dangerous, effective in combat and destructive in peace, exactly the kind of commander who wins battles while creating strategic complications. Modern military analysis struggles with this duality. How do you utilize a commander whose effectiveness requires exactly the traits that make him unsuitable for higher responsibilities? How do you promote tactical genius without empowering political recklessness? The American military never solved this problem during Patton's career, alternating between employing him in combat and sidelining him for non-combat duties, unable to find sustainable solution. Modern armies studying Patton face the same dilemma. His methods work but are ethically problematic. His results are undeniable, but his personal conduct is unacceptable. His contributions to victory are enormous, but his costs are substantial. There's no clean answer. Only recognition that warfare sometimes requires morally complicated people to achieve morally necessary outcomes. 21st century. Digital analysis of World War II operations using modern data science, machine learning, and statistical methods. Researchers compile comprehensive databases of every division's daily positions, casualties, supplies received, enemy forces engaged, terrain crossed. They apply modern analytical techniques to answer questions that contemporaries couldn't address rigorously. Which commanders achieved best results per resources invested? Which tactics produced favourable casualty ratios? Which strategies shortened the war most effectively? The analysis confirms what military historians suspected. Patton's operational methods were among the most efficient in the European theatre. Third Army's casualties per mile advanced, prisoners captured per division engaged, and speed of advance relative to supply tonnage received all rank at or near the top of Allied formations. The data validates Patton's core argument. Aggressive mobile warfare achieves operational objectives faster and with acceptable casualties compared to methodical approaches. But the analysis also reveals limitations. Patton's methods required specific conditions to succeed, including air superiority, fuel availability, and enemy forces already disrupted. When these conditions didn't exist, such as at Metz, Third Army's performance was ordinary. The genius wasn't universal, it was conditional. Patton was brilliant when circumstances allowed aggressive exploitation. He was merely competent when circumstances required siege warfare or careful coordination. The data suggests that Patton's value came from recognizing when conditions favored aggression and exploiting those conditions ruthlessly, not from some universal approach that worked in all situations. The comprehensive assessment of Patton's tactical genius reaches several conclusions that would have pleased and irritated him in equal measure. He was right about mechanized warfare. Speed and aggression work when properly employed. He was right about most of his operational decisions. The August dash across France shortened the war. The Bastogne relief was operationally brilliant. Crossing the Rhine ahead of Montgomery saved casualties. He was probably right that giving Third Army supply priority in September 1944 would have shortened the war, though this remains unprovable, counterfactual. But he was wrong about some crucial things. Soldiers need rest and recovery. Psychiatric casualties are medical issues, not moral failures. Occupation governance requires different skills than combat command. Political considerations legitimately constrain military operations. Patton's tragedy is that he was brilliant in one domain while being catastrophically incompetent in adjacent domains, that his genius was so specialized he became useless outside his specialty, that the army promoted him based on his strengths and then destroyed him through his weaknesses. A more sophisticated understanding of human capability would have kept Patton in combat command and given non-combat responsibilities to others. But World War II-era military culture promoted combat commanders to all senior positions, assuming that success in battle qualified officers for all leadership roles. Patton proved this assumption wrong. He was one of history's great combat commanders. He was one of history's worst occupation governors. Recognizing that both statements are true, that they don't contradict each other, that specialized genius is still genius even if it's not universal, would allow honest assessment of his legacy. But honest assessment requires acknowledging complexity that most people prefer to avoid. So the debate continues, half the commentators declaring Patton a genius hero, the other half declaring him a dangerous fool, both sides partially right and completely unable to acknowledge the legitimacy of the other's perspective. The warrior is dead. The arguments about him will continue forever. 3rd Army Headquarters, 1944, late evening. Staff officers working late notice Patton rehearsing in an empty room, practicing the profanity-laced speech he'll deliver to troops tomorrow. He's alone, speaking to an imaginary audience, testing different phrases, adjusting his delivery, finding the rhythm that will sound spontaneous but is actually carefully choreographed. An aide watches from the doorway, surprised to discover that old Blood and Guts' explosive rhetoric is planned performance rather than spontaneous rage. Patton notices the observer and doesn't break character. Every word matters, he explains. These men need to believe their commander is tougher than the enemy, meaner than the Germans, more willing to kill than anyone they'll face. If they believe that, they'll follow me into hell. So I give them what they need to believe. It's calculated psychological manipulation, aggressive persona constructed deliberately to project dominance and inspire aggression in subordinates. The aide asks if the persona is real or performance. Patton smiles slightly. Does it matter? I've been performing it for so long, I'm not sure I know the difference anymore. The construction of Patton as public persona began early in his career and intensified through years of refinement. The ivory-handled pistols, which Patton wore from the 1920s forward, were deliberately chosen theatrical props. He initially carried pearl-handled revolvers, but switched to ivory after hearing someone refer to pearl-handled pistols as accessories for pimps. The revolvers were Colt 45 and Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum, custom engraved with his initials, visible from hundreds of yards away, designed to make him instantly recognizable. The uniform was custom-tailored, costing multiples of standard-issue cut, to make him appear larger and more imposing. The lacquered helmet liner with oversized rank insignia made him visible on any battlefield, announcing his presence, showing soldiers that their commander shared their danger. The profanity was calculated. Patton deliberately used goddamn and other curses in every speech, believing that aggressive language created aggressive mindset in listeners. Staff officers who worked closely with Patton noted that his private speech was educated and sophisticated, his public speech crude and violent, the difference between the two entirely intentional. The man was constructing a weapon, and the weapon happened to be himself. But the line between performance and reality was never clear, possibly not even to Patton himself. His belief in reincarnation, in having fought in previous wars throughout history, appears to have been genuine. He wrote poetry describing memories of ancient battlefields, published articles discussing his certainty that he'd been a soldier in multiple previous lives, told confidants about dreams where he remembered fighting with Carthaginian armies, Roman legions, Napoleon's cavalry. His staff initially thought this was more performance, theatrical eccentricity designed to create mystique, but Patton's private writings, never intended for publication, contain the same themes. His diary entries describe these memories as real experiences, not metaphors or imagination. He genuinely believed he was an ancient warrior soul, repeatedly reincarnated to fight humanity's wars, that his destiny was predetermined by cosmic forces beyond human understanding, that he'd been preparing for World War II across multiple lifetimes. Modern psychiatric assessment would likely diagnose delusional disorder, possibly bipolar disorder with grandiose features, but Patton's delusions were functional. They gave him absolute confidence in combat, immunity to normal fear, willingness to take risks that rational calculation might prevent. His insanity, if that's what it was, made him more effective rather than less. The question isn't whether he was sane, the question is whether sanity is actually optimal for combat leadership. Field Hospital, 1944, late at night. Patton visits wounded soldiers, sitting at bedsides, writing letters to families, discussing battles and home with men who'll never fight again. He's gentle, compassionate, concerned about each soldier's recovery and future. He stays for hours, long after official visits would require, talking quietly with amputees about their fears and hopes. A nurse watching comments to a colleague that this Patton seems completely different from the profane, aggressive commander who slaps soldiers suffering battle fatigue. Which one is real? She asks. The colleague, an older medical officer who served with Patton before, replies, both. He genuinely cares about wounded soldiers who fought bravely. He has no compassion for anyone he perceives as weak or cowardly. It's not inconsistent to him. He respects courage and despises cowardice, so he's kind to the courageous and cruel to the cowards. He doesn't see anything wrong with that. The nurse asks what happens if someone is suffering psychiatric damage rather than cowardice. The doctor shakes his head. Patton doesn't believe psychiatric damage exists. He thinks it's all moral failure. That's his blindness. He understands physical wounds, but not psychological ones. This blindness, Patton's inability to recognize psychiatric trauma as legitimate medical condition, stemmed from his worldview where willpower overcomes all obstacles. He believed absolutely that mental toughness determines military success, that soldiers who maintain aggressive spirit can accomplish anything, that psychological breakdown represents moral failure rather than medical condition. This belief made him effective. His troops absorbed his confidence, pushed themselves beyond normal limits, achieved objectives that other commanders considered impossible. But the same belief made him cruel. Soldiers suffering genuine psychiatric damage were perceived as weak cowards rather than medical casualties, treated with contempt rather than care, sometimes driven to suicide by shame and rejection. The slapping incidents weren't aberrations, they were logical extensions of Patton's philosophy. If psychiatric casualties are moral failures, then public humiliation is appropriate treatment, shame is therapeutic, and violence is justified to motivate return to duty. Modern military psychology understands this approach as catastrophically wrong, that psychiatric trauma requires treatment, not punishment, that shame and violence worsen rather than improve mental health outcomes. But Patton never learnt this. He died believing that soldiers who couldn't control their fear were cowards, deserving contempt. His genius and his cruelty came from the same source, absolute faith in willpower as solution to all problems. Patton's emotional volatility increased throughout the war, suggesting possible deterioration of whatever psychological condition underlay his personality. Staff officers noted mood swings that became more extreme over time. Euphoric confidence followed by depressive episodes. Aggressive outbursts followed by tearful vulnerability. Grandiose planning followed by paranoid certainty that enemies were undermining him. The pattern suggests bipolar disorder, though diagnosis from historical distance is speculative. What's certain is that Patton's emotional regulation was poor and worsening, that the stress of command was affecting his psychological stability, that the effective commander of early war was becoming the unstable commander of late war. The relief from 3rd Army Command in September 1945 might have been mercy as much as punishment, removing a man who was deteriorating from responsibility he could no longer handle competently. But this interpretation is generous. More likely, the relief was purely political, motivated by Patton's statements, rather than concern for his well-being. The army used Patton's effectiveness when convenient and discarded him when his political liabilities outweighed his military utility. There's no evidence the institution cared about his mental health beyond its impact on operational effectiveness. He was weapon to be used and tool to be discarded. That he was also a human being suffering possible mental illness was irrelevant to an institution that valued him only for what he could produce. The private Patton, known to family and close friends, was substantially different from the public warrior. Letters to Beatrice reveal educated man who read classical literature, discussed poetry, expressed doubt and vulnerability, sought emotional support during difficult periods. He was devoted father who wrote regular letters to his children, concerned about their education and welfare, trying to maintain family connection despite years of separation during wartime. He was thoughtful friend who maintained correspondence with fellow officers, discussing professional concerns and personal struggles, seeking advice and offering support. This private Patton contradicts the aggressive public persona, vulnerable rather, than confident, thoughtful rather than impulsive, seeking connection rather than projecting dominance. The contradiction raises obvious question: which was the real Patton? The answer is probably both and neither. Human personality is complex, containing multitudes, expressing different traits in different contexts. Patton, the aggressive commander, and Patton, the vulnerable husband, weren't separate people. They were different facets of same complex personality, each authentic in its context, neither fully capturing the whole person. The tragedy is that the public persona overwhelmed private reality, that history remembers only blood and guts while forgetting the complicated, struggling, vulnerable human being beneath the performance. Soldiers who served under Patton held contradictory opinions that they could never quite reconcile. They respected his courage. He led from the front, shared dangers, never asked soldiers to go where he wouldn't go himself. They resented his callousness. He accepted casualties that more careful commanders might have avoided, prioritised objectives over individual soldiers' survival, treated men as expendable resources rather than human beings. They appreciated his effectiveness. Operations under his command succeeded more often and more completely than operations under other commanders. They hated his cruelty, the public humiliations, the impossible demands, the punishment of soldiers whose only crime was being human and fallible. These contradictions weren't reconcilable because Patton himself was contradiction, brilliant and foolish, effective and destructive, inspiring and terrifying. Soldiers told stories about him for decades after the war, stories that celebrated his genius and condemned his cruelty, often in the same breath, reflecting the fact that Patton evoked genuinely mixed feelings that couldn't be simplified into pure admiration or pure condemnation. The nickname Old Blood and Guts was both affectionate and bitter. Affectionate recognition of his courage, bitter acknowledgement that it was our blood, his guts, that he spent soldiers' lives while preserving his own glory. Yet the same soldiers who resented him often concluded, reluctantly, that they'd rather serve under Patton than under safer, more cautious commanders, because Patton won battles, and winning battles was what mattered. The moral calculus was impossible. Accept Patton's cruelty and survive through victory, or serve under gentler commanders and possibly die in defeat. Different soldiers calculated differently. None of them ever felt completely comfortable with their choice. Walter Reed Hospital, Washington, D.C., 1953. Charles Kuhl, the soldier Patton slapped at the 15th Evacuation Hospital in August 1943, sits in a psychiatrist's office seeking treatment for depression and anxiety that have plagued him since the war. Kuhl is 36 years old, married with children, working as a factory foreman, functional on the surface but struggling internally. He describes the slapping incident to his psychiatrist, the humiliation of being struck in front of other soldiers, called a coward publicly, having his genuine physical illness, he had malarial fever and chronic dysentery, dismissed as malingering. He explains that he returned to combat after the incident because refusal would have resulted in court-martial, that he fought effectively for the rest of the war, that he was never a coward, but the shame of the incident never left him. For 10 years, he struggled with belief that he failed as a soldier, that Patton was right to call him coward, that his psychological distress was moral weakness rather than medical condition. The psychiatrist diagnoses post-traumatic stress disorder, partially from combat exposure but significantly from the slapping incident itself, which created trauma on top of existing combat stress. Kuhl will receive disability compensation from the VA, partially for combat-related PTSD, partially for psychological damage from the slapping. The second slapping victim, Paul Bennett, experiences similar long-term effects. Decades of depression, inability to process combat experiences, psychological damage from public humiliation that compounds damage from combat exposure. The long-term costs of Patton's command methods extend far beyond the two slapping victims. Third Army's psychiatric casualty rate was proportionally higher than comparable formations, suggesting that command climate discouraged soldiers from seeking mental health treatment. That fear of being labelled coward was so intense that soldiers hid symptoms until breakdown was complete. Post-war studies of Third Army veterans show elevated rates of suicide, depression, alcohol abuse, and family dysfunction compared to veterans of other armies, suggesting that the relentless pace and psychological pressure of service under Patton created lasting damage. This doesn't mean Patton was responsible for all veteran mental health problems. Combat itself causes psychiatric damage regardless of commander. But the evidence suggests that Patton's methods, his contempt for psychiatric casualties, his emphasis on aggressive spirit over human limitations, his use of shame and humiliation as motivational tools, created command climate that worsened rather than mitigated combat stress effects. Modern military psychology understands that command climate significantly affects soldier resilience and recovery, that supportive leadership reduces psychiatric casualties while hostile leadership increases them. Patton's leadership was the opposite of supportive, demanding, contemptuous of weakness, hostile to any sign of human vulnerability. The soldiers who served under him achieved extraordinary operational results. They also suffered extraordinary psychological damage. Both facts are true. Both are parts of Patton's legacy. Third Army casualty statistics reveal uncomfortable truths about the cost of aggressive operations. Third Army sustained approximately 137,000 casualties in 281 days of combat, an average of 487 casualties per day, highest casualty rate per day of any Allied army in the European theatre. The ratio of casualties to ground captured was favourable. Third Army advanced farther per casualty than more methodical armies. But the absolute number of casualties was severe, representing destroyed families, disabled veterans, soldiers who died or were permanently damaged, serving under Patton's command. The question that haunts military ethics: were these casualties necessary? Could different methods have achieved similar results with fewer deaths and injuries? Patton would argue that aggressive operations actually reduced casualties by ending the war faster, that cautious approaches prolonged fighting and ultimately killed more soldiers, that his methods were merciful in aggregate, even if they seemed cruel individually. His critics argue that some of Third Army's operations, particularly the Siege of Metz, resulted in unnecessary casualties, pursuing objectives that could have been bypassed or approached differently, that Patton's competitive desire to beat Montgomery led to operations motivated by glory rather than military necessity, that soldiers died for Patton's ego rather than for operational requirements. Both arguments have merit, neither is definitively provable. The soldiers are still dead, regardless of which argument is correct. Friendly fire incidents provide another measure of Patton's methods' costs. Third Army suffered approximately 16 significant friendly fire incidents during the European campaign, most resulting from coordination failures between rapidly advancing ground forces and supporting air forces. When Third Army advanced 40 miles per day, as during the August breakout, communication and coordination broke down. Tank columns outran their radio communications, appeared in areas where air support was bombing enemy positions, suffered casualties from Allied aircraft that couldn't distinguish friend from enemy amid the chaos. Artillery fired on friendly positions because forward observers lost track of rapidly moving front lines. Adjacent units fired on each other during meeting engagements because nobody knew exactly where friendly forces were. Patton's response to friendly fire casualties was characteristically blunt. Speed is worth the cost. Slower operations would avoid friendly fire, but would also give the enemy time to organise defence and kill more of our soldiers. I'd rather lose some men to friendly fire while maintaining momentum than lose more men to enemy fire after losing momentum. The calculation is cold, but possibly accurate. Friendly fire killed approximately 750 Third Army soldiers during the European campaign. Methodical operations with better coordination might have prevented most of these deaths, but would have extended operations, potentially resulting in thousands more combat deaths. Trading 700 friendly fire casualties for thousands of combat casualties saved is rationally defensible. It's also morally repulsive, reducing human lives to arithmetic, treating soldiers as statistics in optimization problem. Patton saw no moral dilemma. He calculated that aggressive operations saved lives overall. He accepted friendly fire as unavoidable cost of effective operations, and he never lost sleep over the soldiers who died from American fire rather than German. The question of acceptable casualties reveals fundamental tension in military ethics. Whether commanders should minimize casualties in their own unit or minimize casualties across all units, including enemy forces and civilian populations. Patton consistently chose the former. He pushed his troops hard, accepted higher casualties in Third Army, but achieved operational objectives that potentially reduced casualties in other Allied armies and shortened the war overall. If Third Army's August advance prevented 6 months of additional fighting, then Third Army's 16,000 August casualties might have saved hundreds of thousands of other casualties that would have occurred during those 6 additional months of warfare. But this utilitarian calculation requires accepting that Third Army soldiers died to save hypothetical future casualties, that Patton sacrificed his own men for the benefit of the overall Allied war effort, that individual soldiers' lives were traded for collective strategic advantage. Modern military ethics struggles with this calculation, torn between utilitarian logic that accepts some deaths to prevent more deaths, and deontological principles that treating soldiers as means rather than ends violates their human dignity. Patton felt no such struggle. He believed absolutely that winning the war justified any operational decision, that soldiers existed to achieve military objectives, that minimizing friendly casualties at the cost of operational success was cowardice, masquerading as compassion. He was wrong about this. But his wrongness was operationally effective. And the military institution that values effectiveness above all else promoted him, used him, and tacitly endorsed his moral framework by rewarding his results. Post-war reunions of Third Army veterans reveal the complexity of soldiers' feelings about their service under Patton. The reunions are simultaneously celebrations and therapeutic sessions, veterans gathering to commemorate shared experience and to process shared trauma. Soldiers tell stories about Patton that express pride and pain in equal measure. Pride in Third Army's achievements, pain from the costs of those achievements. They describe operations where they thought they'd die, where casualties were so severe that units became combat ineffective, where Patton ordered continued attacks despite losses. They describe the fear of Patton's wrath, which was sometimes more motivating than fear of the enemy. The knowledge that failure to achieve objectives would result in relief of commanders and public humiliation. They describe the impossibility of the demands he made and their amazement that they somehow achieved them anyway. And they describe the lasting psychological damage. Nightmares decades after the war, startled responses to loud noises, inability to discuss combat experiences with family, substance abuse and depression that plague veterans throughout their lives. These are not the stories of soldiers who served under gentle, competent leadership. These are stories of soldiers who survived traumatic experience that shaped the rest of their lives. The trauma was partially from combat itself, the normal effects of warfare on human psychology, but the trauma was also partially from the command climate, the relentless pressure, the contempt for weakness, the use of shame and fear as motivational tools. Patton's legacy lives in these veterans' minds, the pride of having served effectively and the pain of what effectiveness cost. Modern military ethics education uses Patton as case study in command responsibility and acceptable costs. Officer candidates at West Point and other military academies study Third Army operations, analysing tactical decisions and their human consequences. The education doesn't condemn Patton simplistically or celebrate him uncritically. Instead, it attempts to extract useful lessons while acknowledging moral complexity, learn from his operational art while rejecting his approach to soldier welfare, understand his effectiveness while refusing to replicate his cruelty, appreciate his contributions while recognising his failures. The analysis asks difficult questions. When does aggressive leadership become reckless leadership? When do acceptable casualties become excessive casualties? When does demanding excellence become abusing subordinates? How do commanders balance mission accomplishment against soldier welfare when the two conflict? These questions have no clean answers. Military operations inherently require accepting some soldier deaths to achieve objectives. The question is, how many deaths are acceptable and under what circumstances? Patton's answer was, as many as necessary to win quickly and decisively. Modern military ethics seeks more nuanced answer that balances multiple values rather than prioritizing victory absolutely. But modern military ethics hasn't fought world wars requiring existential national commitment. Patton did. And his methods worked in that context. Whether they were necessary or excessive, whether alternatives would have worked better or worse, remains debatable. What's certain is that soldiers paid the price for Patton's methods with their lives, their health, their mental well-being. They paid willingly in many cases, believing they were serving effectively under competent leadership. They paid reluctantly in other cases, hating Patton but obeying orders. Either way, they paid. And the debt is recorded in military cemeteries, VA hospitals, and veterans' traumatized memories. Patton achieved victory. The soldiers bore its cost. Both truths are part of his legacy. Caen, Normandy, July 1944. While Patton sits in England commanding his Phantom Army, Montgomery's British Second Army and Canadian First Army fight for the city of Caen, a D-Day objective that was supposed to fall on June 6th. 5 weeks into the Normandy campaign, British and Canadian forces are still grinding forward against determined German resistance, advancing measured in hundreds of yards per day, casualties mounting steadily. Montgomery's approach is methodical. Massive artillery preparation, overwhelming force concentration, careful consolidation after each advance, minimal risk-taking. The tactics work eventually. Caen falls in mid-July after being reduced to rubble by aerial bombardment and artillery. But the advance is slow, expensive in casualties relative to ground gained. Exactly the kind of set-piece battle that Patton's doctrine was designed to avoid. Montgomery's defenders argue that his operations pinned German armour around Caen, preventing it from opposing American breakout at Saint-Lô. That slow British advance served strategic purpose by fixing enemy forces. Patton's advocates argue that Montgomery's caution created the stalemate that required American breakout, that more aggressive British operations could have achieved breakthrough without American intervention. Both assessments contain truth. Neither is entirely fair to the other commander. But the contrast is stark. Montgomery advances 6 miles in 6 weeks. Patton will advance 400 miles in 30 days once he's unleashed. Different commanders, different methods, radically different results. The comparison between Patton and Montgomery becomes intensely personal during the Sicily campaign and continues throughout the war, fueled by both commanders' competitive egos and their fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Montgomery believes in careful preparation, overwhelming superiority at the point of attack, methodical exploitation after breakthrough, minimizing casualties through superior planning and firepower. His approach works. Montgomery rarely loses battles, rarely suffers catastrophic failures, consistently achieves objectives given adequate time and resources. But his approach is slow, requires extensive preparation that gives enemies time to prepare defences, often allows defeated enemies to escape rather than being destroyed. Patton believes in speed, surprise, accepting risk to maintain momentum, exploiting enemy confusion before they can recover, destroying enemy forces rather than merely defeating them. His approach works when conditions allow aggressive operations. Good weather, adequate fuel, enemy forces already disrupted. But his approach fails when conditions don't. Support mobility. At Metz during the fuel shortage, his army bogs down in exactly the kind of attritional siege warfare his doctrine was supposed to prevent. The comparison reveals that neither approach is universally superior. Each works in specific conditions and fails in others. Montgomery's methodical approach succeeds in difficult terrain against prepared defences but misses opportunities for decisive exploitation. Patton's aggressive approach achieves spectacular results in mobile warfare, but becomes costly when mobility is constrained. Ideally, Allied command would employ each commander in situations suited to his strengths. In practice, coalition politics, personality conflicts, and competition for resources create inefficiency. Omar Bradley presents a third model: competent professionalism without Montgomery's caution or Patton's recklessness. Bradley commands American forces through Normandy breakout, across France, into Germany with steady competence, achieving objectives on schedule without the spectacular advances Patton achieves, but also without the periodic stagnation Montgomery experiences. Bradley's casualty ratios are acceptable, his operational planning is sound, his coordination with adjacent units is excellent. He's exactly the kind of commander that large military organizations value. Predictable, reliable, politically skilled, effective within established doctrine. He's also Patton's former subordinate, promoted over Patton to command American ground forces in Normandy, given command of 12th Army Group, while Patton commands 3rd Army within Bradley's group. The reversal of their relationship creates lasting tension. Patton believes Bradley was promoted for political safety rather than tactical brilliance, that Bradley's competence is mediocre compared to Patton's genius. That institutional preference for safe predictability over risky innovation explains why Bradley commands while Patton is subordinated. Bradley believes Patton's tactical brilliance doesn't compensate for his political disasters, that commanding large formations requires skills Patton lacks, that Patton's relief from 3rd Army Command in September 1945 proved that tactical genius without political judgment disqualifies officers from highest responsibilities. Both men are partially right. Neither can acknowledge the other's perspective without diminishing his own achievements. The statistical comparison between commanders supports Patton's arguments while revealing limitations. 3rd Army advanced farther per day than any comparable Allied formation in the European theatre. Approximately 4.3 miles per day versus approximately 2.1 miles per day for British 21st Army Group, and approximately 2.7 miles per day for American 1st Army. 3rd Army captured more prisoners per division engaged, approximately 85,000 prisoners per division versus approximately 45,000 per division for other armies. 3rd Army's casualty ratio was approximately 1-to-1 for killed and wounded, but approximately 10-to-1 for prisoners captured, suggesting that rapid advance prevented German forces from organizing effective defense, captured entire units before they could fight effectively. But Third Army also received less supply tonnage per division than Montgomery's armies, and comparable tonnage to Bradley's First Army, suggesting that Patton achieved superior results with comparable or inferior resources. The conclusion seems clear. Patton's methods were more efficient than alternatives, but this conclusion overlooks contextual factors. Third Army operated mostly in open terrain suitable for mobile warfare. Montgomery's armies fought through difficult bocage terrain and river obstacles. Third Army faced German forces already disrupted by earlier fighting. Montgomery's armies faced fresh German divisions immediately after D-Day. Third Army exploited breakthrough created by First Army at Saint-Lô. Montgomery's armies created conditions that made that breakthrough possible. Statistical comparison without contextual understanding produces misleading conclusions. German assessments of Allied commanders provide external perspective uncoloured by inter-Allied politics. Wehrmacht intelligence compiled detailed profiles of Allied commanders, attempting to identify which posed greatest threats and what tactics they preferred. The assessments of Montgomery describe him as predictable but dangerous. Montgomery always attacks with overwhelming force after extensive preparation. His operations are obvious days in advance, but difficult to stop because he commits such superior resources. He never takes risks, but also rarely makes mistakes. Defeating him requires either preventing his build-up or accepting that prepared positions will eventually be overrun. The assessments of Bradley describe him as competent but unimaginative. Bradley coordinates multiple divisions effectively and maintains steady pressure. His operations are methodical and coordinated but lack imagination. He rarely creates surprises but also rarely presents opportunities for counterattack. The assessments of Patton are consistently different. Patton is the most dangerous Allied commander because he thinks like a German panzer officer. He appears unexpectedly, attacks from unpredicted directions, maintains momentum even when logical pause would consolidate gains. His operations resembled Guderian's methods: speed, surprise, deep exploitation, disruption of rear areas. Facing Patton requires mobile reserves positioned to respond to unexpected threats, not prepared defences on predicted axes. The German assessments validate Patton's self-image. He was the Allied commander who most resembled German doctrine, the one German officers respected and feared most. Postwar memoirs by the commanders reveal their assessments of each other, filtered through decades of reflection and lingering resentment. Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, praises all his subordinate commanders, while carefully noting their limitations. Of Montgomery, a great soldier, absolutely first class in planning and preparation, whose caution sometimes prevented exploitation of success. Of Bradley, supremely competent, master of coordination and logistics, the ideal commander for large-scale operations requiring multiple armies working in harmony. Of Patton, probably the best ground commander in attack that the war produced, but hopeless in tasks requiring political judgment or administrative skill. The assessments are diplomatic but reveal Eisenhower's priorities. He valued coordination and political reliability over tactical brilliance, preferred commanders he could control over commanders who might win battles while creating political crises. Montgomery's memoirs barely mention Patton, except to dismiss American operations as reckless and poorly coordinated compared to British professionalism. Bradley's memoirs describe Patton with mixture of admiration and resentment, acknowledgement of tactical skill combined with criticism of personal behaviour and political indiscretions. Patton, who died before writing his full memoir, left diary entries that express contempt for Montgomery's caution, frustration with Bradley's promotion over him, and complicated relationship with Eisenhower, combining gratitude for opportunities given and resentment for constraints imposed. Modern military analysis attempts to synthesize these competing assessments into coherent understanding of relative effectiveness. The consensus among military historians is that Patton was the best operational commander, Montgomery was the best at set-piece battles, Bradley was the best at coordinating large formations, and Eisenhower was the best at managing coalition warfare. Each commander excelled in his specialty, none was universally superior. Patton's genius was operational art, rapid exploitation, maintaining tempo, disrupting enemy planning through speed and unpredictability. Montgomery's genius was methodical warfare, careful planning, overwhelming force, minimizing friendly casualties through superior preparation. Bradley's genius was coordination, managing multiple armies, ensuring adjacent units supported each other, maintaining steady pressure across wide fronts. Eisenhower's genius was strategic leadership, managing coalition politics, balancing competing national interests, maintaining Allied unity despite personality conflicts and strategic disagreements. World War II required all these capabilities. No single commander possessed them all. The ideal command structure would have employed each commander in roles matching his strengths. The actual command structure was constrained by coalition politics, promotion systems that prioritized seniority and political reliability, and personality conflicts that prevented optimal employment of talent. The counterfactual questions are tantalizing and ultimately unprovable. What if Patton had commanded on D-Day instead of Bradley? Would aggressive exploitation have shortened the Normandy campaign, or would reckless advance have resulted in disaster? What if Patton had received supply priority in September 1944 instead of Montgomery? Would Third Army have crossed the Rhine and shortened the war, or would overextended supply lines have created vulnerable salient that Germans could cut off? What if Patton had remained focused on combat command instead of being assigned occupation duties? Would he have continued effective operations into 1946, or would his methods have eventually failed against more desperate German resistance? These questions assume that changing commanders would change outcomes, that individual leadership matters more than material superiority, logistics, and strategic circumstances. The assumption is partially true. Commanders matter, especially at operational level, where Patton excelled. But commanders operate within constraints: available resources, strategic guidance, coalition politics, enemy capabilities. Patton's genius was maximizing results within his constraints. But he couldn't overcome all constraints through willpower and aggressive tactics. His effectiveness required specific conditions: adequate fuel, air superiority, enemy forces already disrupted, terrain suitable for mobile operations. When these conditions existed, Patton was brilliant. When they didn't exist, he was ordinary. Understanding Patton's relative effectiveness requires understanding not just what he achieved, but under what conditions he achieved it and what might have been achieved by different commanders in similar conditions. The final assessment must acknowledge that comparing commanders is inherently problematic because they operated in different contexts, facing different challenges with different resources. Montgomery fought in difficult terrain against concentrated German defences immediately after D-Day. Patton exploited breakthrough after German defences were disrupted. Bradley coordinated multiple armies across wide fronts. Patton commanded single army in focused operations. Comparing their results without accounting for different contexts produces misleading conclusions. What's certain is that Patton achieved spectacular results when employed in offensive operations with adequate resources, that his methods were effective within their context, that German commanders respected and feared him more than other Allied commanders. What's also certain is that Patton's effectiveness was conditional, that his methods required specific circumstances to succeed, that his tactical genius didn't translate to administrative competence or political judgment. The warrior who won battles couldn't govern occupied territories. The operational artist who crossed France in weeks couldn't navigate Washington politics. Specialized genius is still genius, but it's not universal capability. And military institutions that promote based on combat performance without considering other required skills create problems when combat ends and other missions begin. Patton was the right commander for mobile warfare in Europe in 1944. He was the wrong commander for occupation governance in 1945. Both statements are true. Both are part of his legacy. And both reveal that even genius has limits. Vietnam. 1967. American forces are fighting counterinsurgency warfare in Southeast Asian jungles, a conflict utterly different from World War II's conventional campaigns. General Creighton Abrams, Deputy Commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, addresses his staff about operational philosophy and mentions Patton, under whom Abrams served as a young officer in Third Army. Patton couldn't command here, Abrams says. Everything he believed about warfare is wrong for this environment. Patton believed in speed, aggression, destroying enemy armies in decisive battle. Here, there are no front lines, no enemy armies to destroy, no decisive battles to win. Patton would try to find the enemy's main force and crush it in 72 hours. But the enemy's strategy is to avoid decisive engagement, to exhaust us through attrition, to win politically rather than militarily. Patton's genius was irrelevant to the war we're actually fighting. Abrams is right. Vietnam proves that Patton's model of warfare has limits, that his methods work only against conventional enemies fighting conventional battles. Counterinsurgency requires different skills: patience, cultural understanding, political sophistication, acceptance that military force alone doesn't produce victory. These are exactly the skills Patton lacked. The acknowledgement that Patton couldn't have commanded successfully in Vietnam is simultaneously criticism and tribute. Criticism of his limitations, tribute to his specialized excellence in the warfare he understood. But 24 years later, Patton's model proves relevant again. Kuwait, February 1991, Operation Desert Storm. General Norman Schwarzkopf commands coalition forces, executing a massive flanking maneuver against Iraqi forces occupying Kuwait. A Hail Mary sweep through empty desert to attack Iraqi Republican Guard divisions from unexpected direction. The maneuver covers approximately 200 miles in 100 hours, bypassing Iraqi defensive lines, achieving complete surprise, destroying Iraqi armor in running battles reminiscent of Third Army's August 1944 advance through France. Schwarzkopf explicitly acknowledges Patton's influence. We studied Third Army operations extensively in planning this campaign. The principles are timeless. Speed creates surprise, surprise creates shock, shock creates paralysis, paralysis creates opportunity for destruction. Patton understood this in 1944. It works just as well in 1991. The Gulf War demonstrates that conventional warfare against conventional enemies still rewards Patton's approach, that his operational art remains relevant when conditions support mobile armoured warfare. The lesson isn't that Patton's methods always work. The lesson is that they work in specific contexts against specific enemies, that understanding when to apply which methods requires judgment about the type of war being fought. Iraq, 2003. The invasion of Iraq demonstrates both the relevance and limitations of Patton's legacy. The initial conventional campaign, racing from Kuwait to Baghdad in 3 weeks, resembles Patton's mobile operations. Rapid advance, bypassing resistance, maintaining momentum, achieving objectives faster than enemy can respond. American armoured columns cover 500 miles in 21 days, destroying Iraqi military forces, toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. It's tactically brilliant, operationally effective, strategically successful conventional warfare. Then the occupation begins, and everything Patton would recognise ends. American forces face insurgency, sectarian violence, political chaos, requiring skills completely foreign to Patton's experience, cultural sensitivity, patient relationship building, acceptance that military force alone cannot achieve political objectives, understanding that killing enemies sometimes creates more enemies than it eliminates. The officers who commanded brilliantly during the invasion struggled during occupation, lacking training and doctrine for stabilization operations. The pattern from Patton's career repeats at organizational level. Military institution that excels at conventional combat struggles at everything else. The invasion succeeds because it resembles warfare Patton understood. The occupation struggles because it requires capabilities Patton never developed. Both outcomes reflect his legacy. Brilliant at his specialty, inadequate outside it. West Point, New York. 2020. Military Academy cadets study Patton as historical figure and ethical case study. The education is nuanced, attempting to extract useful lessons while acknowledging moral complexity. Cadets analyse Third Army operations, learning operational art and mobile warfare principles. They study Patton's leadership methods, identifying effective practices like visible courage and personal example while rejecting abusive practices like public humiliation and contempt for psychiatric casualties. They discuss the slapping incidents as failures of leadership and judgment. They debate whether Patton could command in modern military environment with media transparency, social media, political oversight, legal constraints on commander behaviour. The consensus is negative. Patton's methods violated too many modern norms to be acceptable. His public statements would create too many crises. His treatment of subordinates would result in relief and possibly criminal charges. But the cadets also recognise that something valuable would be lost if modern military eliminated all officers like Patton. Willingness to take risks, refusal to accept conventional limitations, aggressive pursuit of victory regardless of obstacles. The question the education poses but cannot definitively answer: can modern militaries cultivate Patton's virtues while eliminating his vices? Can you train officers to be aggressive without being reckless, demanding without being cruel, confident without being arrogant? Or are these traits inevitably linked, package deals, where you accept all of Patton or reject all of him? The cultural legacy extends beyond military institutions. Patton became American cultural icon through Francis Ford Coppola's 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott, in performance that defined public memory of the general for generations. The film presents Patton as a complicated figure, brilliant warrior whose effectiveness is inseparable from his flaws, man out of time fighting modern war with ancient warrior ethos, tragic hero whose greatness is also his downfall. Scott's performance captures Patton's contradictions. The opening speech, profane and aggressive, becoming an iconic expression of American military confidence. The slapping scenes, showing cruel leadership and poor judgment. The relief from command, showing institutional limits on even successful commanders. President Richard Nixon watched the film repeatedly before ordering the Cambodia incursion in 1970, reportedly inspired by Patton's aggressive decisiveness. The fact that political leaders sought inspiration from Hollywood version of historical figure rather than from actual historical record reveals how cultural memory replaces history. The film becomes more real than reality. Scott's performance becomes who Patton was in public imagination. Complex historical figure simplifies into archetypal warrior. This cultural legacy is both tribute and distortion. Tribute to Patton's genuine impact, distortion of complicated reality into simplified narrative. Academic historians produce more nuanced assessment than popular culture allows. The scholarly consensus views Patton as operational artist whose tactical innovations in mobile warfare had lasting influence on armored doctrine, whose aggressive leadership achieved spectacular results in specific contexts, whose personal flaws and political disabilities prevented him from achieving higher responsibilities despite tactical brilliance. The assessment acknowledges his contributions: development of American tank doctrine in World War I, advocacy for mechanized warfare during interwar period when institution resisted, effective combat leadership in North Africa and Europe, operational achievements at Bastogne and Rhine crossing. The assessment also acknowledges his failures: inability to govern occupied territories, public statements that created diplomatic crises, cruel treatment of subordinates, including psychiatric casualties, moral blindness about acceptable costs of aggressive operations. The scholarly view resists simplification into hero worship or condemnation, attempting to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Patton was necessary for Allied victory in World War II. Patton's methods were sometimes morally wrong. Patton's contributions outweighed his costs in context of existential warfare. Patton's example should inspire caution about costs of victory as much as admiration for achievement. This nuanced view satisfies academics but frustrates popular audiences who prefer clear heroes or clear villains, not complicated figures requiring sustained thought to understand. Military doctrine absorbs Patton's contributions while rejecting his excesses. Modern American armor doctrine emphasizes speed, maneuver, and surprise principles Patton advocated throughout his career. Mission command philosophy gives subordinate commanders initiative to exploit opportunities without waiting for higher approval, similar to Patton's guidance to never tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and let them surprise you with their results. Combined arms integration, coordinating armor, infantry, artillery, and aviation in synchronized operations reflects tactics Patton refined in Third Army operations. But modern doctrine also emphasizes leader responsibility for soldier welfare, prohibits abusive leadership practices, requires commanders to balance mission accomplishment against force preservation, recognizes psychiatric casualties as medical conditions requiring treatment rather than moral failures requiring punishment. The synthesis attempts to preserve Patton's operational genius while eliminating his leadership failures, to teach his tactics while rejecting his callousness. Whether this synthesis succeeds remains debatable. Some argue that Patton's effectiveness required exactly the qualities modern military rejects, that you cannot have his results without accepting his methods, that sanitizing his legacy into acceptable lessons loses what made him special. Others argue that learning from historical figures requires critical assessment of both strengths and weaknesses, that blindly replicating all aspects of historical practice perpetuates historical errors, that military institutions must evolve beyond past limitations while preserving timeless principles. The final question is whether Patton represents the past or the future of warfare. His methods, developed for World War II era mechanized combat, seem increasingly obsolete in an era of counterinsurgency, cyber warfare, and precision strike. Modern warfare emphasizes information dominance, technological superiority, and limited application of force rather than massed armored assaults. Patton's aggressive exploitation tactics seem relics of industrial age warfare, but periodically conventional warfare returns. Gulf War in 1991, Iraq invasion in 2003, potential future conflicts with peer competitors possessing conventional militaries. In these contexts, Patton's principles remain relevant. Speed creates opportunities, aggression exploits disorganization, momentum prevents enemy recovery, psychological shock is as important as physical destruction. Military strategists debate whether to optimize forces for counterinsurgency and hybrid threats or to maintain capability for conventional warfare requiring Patton-style operations. The debate reflects uncertainty about future warfare's character. If future wars resemble World War II, Patton's legacy is essential. If future wars resemble Vietnam or Afghanistan, Patton's legacy is irrelevant. If future wars include both types, military institutions need officers who understand when to apply which model. The synthesis remains elusive. But the question persists: does American military need more Pattons or fewer Pattons? The answer depends on what wars America expects to fight. George Patton died 79 years ago, yet arguments about his legacy continue. Veterans organizations honor him as American hero, one of the great combat commanders in American history, a man who shortened World War II and saved countless lives through aggressive operations. Peace activists criticize him as embodiment of militaristic values that glorify violence and treat human life as expendable resource. Academic historians debate his place in military history, innovator who transformed armored warfare or tactician who applied existing doctrine more aggressively than contemporaries. Military professionals study his operations, genius whose methods should be emulated or product of specific historical circumstances irreplicable in modern warfare. The debates will continue because Patton represents unresolved tensions in how societies think about warfare. Is aggressive pursuit of military victory always justified in existential conflicts? Do ends justify means when defending against totalitarian aggression? Can modern democracies tolerate commanders whose effectiveness requires methods that violate democratic values? Should military institutions cultivate warrior spirit that sometimes manifests as cruel indifference to human suffering? These questions have no permanent answers. Each generation reassesses them based on contemporary circumstances and values. Patton's legacy serves as perpetual test case for these questions, historical figure whose life and career illuminate tensions that warfare creates between effectiveness and ethics, victory and humanity, military necessity and moral limits. The boy who sat in his grandfather's library listening to Homer, who believed he was destined for military greatness, who spent 60 years pursuing that destiny, achieved everything he believed he was born to accomplish. He commanded armies, won battles, conquered territories, earned respect from enemies and allies. He proved his theories about mechanized warfare correct. He vindicated decades of advocacy for aggressive armored operations. He shortened World War II and contributed decisively to Allied victory. He fulfilled the destiny he felt certain about since childhood. Yet he died believing he'd failed, that institutional resistance had prevented him from achieving all he could have accomplished, that political considerations had constrained military genius, that he'd been sidelined when he should have been unleashed. Both assessments are true. Patton achieved greatness and fell short of his potential. He won his battles and lost his wars with military bureaucracy. He fulfilled his destiny and remained unsatisfied. He became the warrior hero he dreamed of becoming and discovered that reality of heroism involves moral compromises and human costs that childhood dreams don't acknowledge. His tragedy isn't that he failed. His tragedy is that success wasn't enough. That achieving everything you believed you were born to do doesn't guarantee satisfaction or peace. That destiny fulfilled can feel empty when you realize what you sacrificed to achieve it. The warrior found his wars. He fought brilliantly. He won decisively. And he died alone in a hospital bed from a random accident, proving that even the greatest warriors are ultimately just humans, vulnerable to chance, mortal despite achievements, Forgotten eventually by history that remembers only simplified versions of complicated truths. George Patton deserves to be remembered. But he deserves to be remembered completely. The genius and the fool, the hero and the villain, the brilliant tactician and the cruel commander, the man who shortened a war, and the man who left thousands of damaged soldiers in his wake. Remember all of him. Or understand none of him.